On a cold autumn night in medieval Europe, borders were not lines on a map. They were claims whispered in royal halls, promises written in blood, and arguments passed down from father to son. The 100 Years' War did not begin with a single battle or a formal declaration. It began quietly, with a question that would haunt two kingdoms for more than a century. Who had the right to rule France? In the early 14th century, England and France were deeply entangled. English kings still held lands on French soil. French nobles owed loyalty to English rulers, and English monarchs claimed descent from French royal blood. When the French crown passed to a new dynasty in 1328, England's king believed the throne should have been his. France disagreed, and from that disagreement, one of the longest and most destructive wars in European history slowly unfolded. At first, the conflict seemed like another feud between royal families. Few could imagine it would stretch across generations, reshaping both nations forever. But once armies began to move, and once the first arrows darkened the sky, there would be no easy return to peace. The early phase of the war shocked Europe. England, smaller and poorer than France, won victories that seemed impossible. At battles like Crécy and Poitiers, English longbowmen destroyed French armies that were larger, wealthier, and led by knights trained from childhood to fight. French cavalry charged with honour and tradition. English arrows answered with ruthless efficiency. Entire generations of French nobility were cut down in muddy fields. These victories were not just military successes, they were psychological blows. France was supposed to be the strongest kingdom in Western Europe. Yet again and again, its armies collapsed. Its king was even captured and taken to England. For the first time, the idea that France could truly lose, perhaps even cease to exist as an independent power, began to feel real. Then came the plague. The Black Death swept across Europe in the middle of the war, killing millions. Villages emptied, fields went unploughed, armies disintegrated before they even met the enemy. War paused, not because of peace, but because there were not enough living men left to fight. When the conflict resumed, both kingdoms were changed, scarred, weakened, more desperate. As decades passed, the war became something darker. It was no longer only about kings and crowns. It seeped into everyday life. Soldiers without pay turned into roaming bands of mercenaries, burning villages and terrorizing civilians. Loyalty became a fragile thing. Cities changed sides. Noble families betrayed one another. France, in particular, began to fracture from within. By the early 15th century, France was collapsing. Civil war tore the kingdom apart. Rival factions fought for control of the crown while the English watched carefully, waiting for the perfect moment. That moment came when a powerful English king crossed the Channel and marched deep into French territory. The Battle of Agincourt became legend. Outnumbered, exhausted and sick, the English army should have been destroyed. Instead, they stood on muddy ground and let the French charge. Heavy armour sank into the earth. Arrows fell like rain. When the fighting ended, thousands of French knights lay dead, and England stood victorious once again. After Agincourt, the impossible began to feel inevitable. English forces advanced, French resistance weakened, and then came the treaty that nearly erased France from history. According to its terms, the English king would inherit the French crown. The French heir was disinherited. France, in theory, would become part of a single Anglo-French realm ruled from London. On parchment, the war was over. England had won. But history rarely obeys ink and seals. Large parts of France refused to accept the agreement. The countryside simmered with resentment. And in a small village, far from courts and treaties, a young peasant girl claimed she heard voices. voices telling her that France had not yet fallen, and that she had a role to play. Her arrival changed the war in ways no general could have planned. She did not bring armies or weapons. She brought belief. At a moment when France had nearly given up on itself, she offered something dangerously powerful: hope. Against all logic, French forces rallied. A key city was relieved. Momentum shifted. The idea that England's victory was inevitable began to crack. Even after the girl was captured and executed, the spark she lit did not die. France slowly rebuilt its confidence, its army, and its identity. The later years of the war were quieter, but no less decisive. France adopted new tactics. Artillery grew more effective. English supply lines stretched thin. One by one, English-held territories fell back into French hands. There was no single final battle, no dramatic surrender. England simply faded out of France. When the war finally ended in 1453, England had lost almost everything it once held on the continent. France, battered but alive, emerged more unified than it had been before. A kingdom that had nearly been absorbed was now unmistakably its own. The 100 Years' War did not truly last 100 years. It lasted longer, and its effects lasted far longer still. It transformed warfare, weakened feudalism, and helped give birth to national identity. England turned inward, its dreams of continental empire quietly abandoned. France learned painfully that survival required unity. And perhaps the most haunting truth of all is this: England did not fail because it was weak. It failed because ruling France forever required more than victories and treaties. It required the consent of a people who, even in their darkest hour, refused to disappear. As the candles burn low and the noise of battle fades into memory, what remains is not the clash of steel, but the quiet persistence of a nation that came frighteningly close to being lost and endured anyway. If you are listening to this story to rest, to drift into sleep, remember this softly. History is not only shaped by those who almost win, but by those who refuse, again and again, to be erased. Now, let the weight of the present day slide off your shoulders like a heavy woolen cloak, unclasped and dropped to the floor. Close your eyes and breathe in the imagined air of a stone chamber, cool and smelling faintly of dried lavender and old beeswax. We are drifting back to a time before the maps were drawn in ink, back to the year 1328, where the trouble truly begins. Imagine a silence falling over the great city of Paris. It is a heavy, anxious silence. The King of France, Charles IV, has just died. This is not just a moment of mourning, it is a moment of panic. You see, for over 300 years the French crown had passed smoothly from father to son, a stroke of luck so consistent it felt like divine intervention, or perhaps just very good genetics. They called it the Capetian miracle. But now the miracle has run out. Charles leaves no son. The direct line is broken. The throne is empty, and the wind whistling through the corridors of the Louvre Palace feels colder than usual. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. In London, a young man's eyes turn toward that empty throne. This is Edward III, the King of England. He is only 16 years old, sharp, ambitious, and undoubtedly thinking that a double crown would look very handsome on his head. His claim is actually quite strong. His mother, Isabella, was the sister of the dead French king. By blood, Edward is the closest male relative. In a modern court of law, he might have had a case, But medieval politics was rarely about fairness. It was about who could gather the most spears. The French nobility looked across the English Channel and recoiled. The idea of being ruled by an Englishman was distasteful enough, but being ruled by this Englishman was worse. They whispered that the crown could not pass through a woman, a rule they pulled from the ancient codes of the Salic Franks. Historians still argue whether this Salic law was a genuine legal precedent or just a convenient dusty scroll the French lawyers found under a rug to keep the English out. It's a bit like finding an old homeowners association rule just to stop your neighbour from painting his fence a colour you hate. Regardless of the legal gymnastics, the French assembly chose a different man, Philip of Valois, a cousin to the dead king. He became Philip VI. He was French, he was a man, and he was there. That was enough. Edward was furious, but he was also young and dealing with his own troubles at home, so he stayed his hand. For a moment it seemed peace might hold. The two men even met in 1329, inside the magnificent Cathedral of Amiens. Picture the scene, the sunlight streaming through stained glass, painting the stone floor in pools of ruby and sapphire. Edward, the young King of England, dressed in crimson velvet and gold, had to kneel before Philip, the King of France, to pay homage for his lands in Aquitaine. It was a ritual of submission. Edward was a king in his own right, yet here he was, on his knees, pledging loyalty to a man he considered a usurper. He muttered the words, but he refused to clasp his hands. Within Philip's, a subtle petty act of defiance that probably made the diplomats in the room sweat through their tunics. It is a strange historical truth that this war, which would consume millions of lives, began with a legal dispute over property rights, much like a very high-stakes divorce settlement. Edward owned Aquitaine, a massive, wealthy region in southwest France, known for its wine and its sunshine. Philip wanted it back. He didn't like having a foreign king as a tenant. The tension simmered for 8 years, a slow-burning fuse creeping toward a barrel of gunpowder. The explosion finally came in 1337. Philip, tired of Edward's arrogance, declared that Edward had forfeited his right to Aquitaine and ordered the land confiscated. It was a power move intended to humble the English boy. Instead, it unleashed a lion. Edward did not just argue for his land this time. He went further. He drafted a letter, sealed with red wax, and challenged Philip's right to the French throne itself. He declared himself the true King of France. The glove was thrown. The long peace was over. As the messengers rode out with these declarations of war, the peasants in the fields of Normandy and the shepherds in the hills of Yorkshire had no idea that their great-grandchildren would still be fighting this same war. The air grew heavy. The forges began to ring with the sound of hammers on steel. And in the quiet dark of 1337, the first ripples of a storm began to spread, a storm that would blow for 100 years. The storm that had been gathering in the royal courts of Paris and London did not break immediately over the fields of France. Instead, it drifted north, carried by the wind and the tides, until it settled heavily upon the grey, churning waters of the English Channel. For the first few years of this conflict, the war was a ghost, a thing of rumours, embargoes, and stolen merchant ships. It was a war of wool and wine, of coins counted in counting houses rather than arrows loosed in anger. But by the summer of 1340, the ghost was ready to take on flesh. The French king, Philip VI, had assembled a terrifying armada, a great army of the sea, intended to crush the English navy before it could even leave its own harbours. They gathered in the inlet of Sluys, a quiet stretch of water on the border of what is now Belgium and the Netherlands. Picture the scene on Midsummer's Eve. The inlet at Sluys is not the open ocean. It is a mouth of the sea, fed by the river's wind. On this day, the water is so crowded with timber and sail that a man could almost walk from one bank to the other without wetting his boots. The French fleet is massive, over 200 ships, their masts rising like a stripped pine forest against the pale Flemish sky. Among them is the Christopher, a prize ship captured from the English the year before, now humiliatingly flying the French flag. The French admirals, confident in their numbers, have made a decision that historians still puzzle over with a mixture of confusion and pity. Instead of engaging the English in the open water, where they could use their superior numbers to surround the enemy, they decide to transform the sea into land. They chain their ships together, hull to hull, iron to wood, creating a massive, floating wooden wall across the mouth of the estuary. It is a defensive line, a barricade of oak and iron floating on the tide. They are thinking like knights, not sailors. They want a castle, even if they have to build it on the water. On the horizon, the English fleet appears. King Edward III is there in person, standing on the deck of his flagship, the Thomas. He is young, eager, and perhaps a little terrified, though a king must never show it. He sees the French wall blocking his path. The sun is high, gleaming off the water and blinding his men. A lesser commander might have attacked immediately, driven by adrenaline, but Edward waits. He orders his captains to drop anchor and drift. They wait for hours. The French, watching from their chained fortress, jeer and shout, thinking the English are afraid. They do not realize that Edward is not hesitating. He is calculating. He is waiting for the tide to turn and for the sun to begin its slow descent. He wants the wind at his back and the golden, blinding light of the setting sun in the eyes of his enemies. It is a lesson in patience that the English will use again and again. The land, or in this case the sea, is a weapon if you know how to hold it. When the tide finally shifts, turning the water into a conveyor belt pushing toward the French line, the English hoist their sails. The wind fills the canvas with a snap like a cracking whip. The ships surge forward. This is not a battle of sleek manoeuvres or cannon fire. This is a medieval brawl. As the English ships crash into the French line, the sound is deafening. The groan of crushing timber, the scream of tearing metal, and the roar of thousands of men. Because the French ships are chained together, they cannot move. They are a sitting target. The English ships grapple onto them, and suddenly the sea battle becomes a land battle. Archers lean over the railings, their longbows bending like willow branches. This is the debut of the weapon that will define the century. The English longbow is not merely a hunting tool. In the hands of a trained yeoman, it is a machine of rhythm and death. The arrows fly in a dense cloud, hissing like angry vipers. They fall upon the French decks with a sound like heavy rain on a tin roof. The French crossbowmen, brave as they are, cannot compete. A crossbow is powerful, but slow to reload. You must crank it back, set the bolt, aim and fire. In the time it takes a French sailor to loose one bolt, an English archer has sent 6 arrows whistling through the air. The French decks are swept clean. Panic begins to spread, a cold contagion moving from ship to ship. The fighting is brutal and claustrophobic. Men in heavy mail armour grapple on slippery decks, sword against axe, dagger against shield. The water below churns, dark and unforgiving. To fall overboard in armour is to sink like a stone. There is no swimming for a knight encased in steel. It is said that the fighting was so fierce that the ocean itself seemed to turn red, and yet amidst the horror there is a strange, detached beauty to the scene, the colourful, heraldic flags fluttering in the chaotic wind, the sun dipping lower, casting long golden shadows across the tangle of broken masts. The Christopher is retaken, the English cheering as their own flag rises once more up the mainmast, a symbol of reclamation. By the time the moon rises, reflecting in the calm, Debris-strewn water. The French fleet has been annihilated. It is a catastrophe for France. Almost 20,000 French sailors and soldiers are lost. The magnitude of the defeat is so great that no one in the French court dares to tell King Philip. They fear his temper, or perhaps they simply cannot find the words to describe such a total loss. In the end, the court jester is the only one brave enough to break the news. He wanders into the king's presence, shaking his head and muttering, "Oh, the English are such cowards, such cowardly, timid little men." When the confused King Philip asks why, the jester looks up with sad, painted eyes and says, "Because they did not jump into the sea like our brave Frenchmen did." It is a moment of dark humour in a very dark time, a small release of pressure in a court suffocating under the weight of bad news. The Battle of Sluys changes everything. It does not win the war for Edward, but it ensures that the war will be fought on French soil, not English. The English Channel is now an English moat. The threat of a French invasion, which had terrified the coastal villages of Kent and Sussex, vanishes like sea mist in the morning sun. Edward can now land his armies whenever he pleases. He has the keys to the gate. But victory at sea does not mean victory on land. Edward's treasury is empty, war is an expensive hobby, and he has pawned everything from the royal crown to the Queen's jewellery to pay for his ships. He is a king in debt, standing on the shores of a continent that does not want him. The euphoria of Sluys fades quickly as the reality of logistics sets in. He has an army, but he cannot feed them on glory alone. He needs money, he needs allies, and he needs to force the French king to face him in the open field, something Philip is far too clever to do just yet. For the next few years, the war enters a strange, rhythmic lull. There are skirmishes in Brittany, sieges that go nowhere, and truces that are signed in ink and broken in spirit. It feels as though the two kingdoms are boxers circling each other in the ring, testing for weakness, throwing jabs, but holding back the knockout blow. The English soldiers, many of them simple farmers who have never been further than their local market town, find themselves marching through the lush green countryside of France. They see vineyards for the first time, taste wines that make their heads spin, and marvel at the stone cathedrals rising like mountains from the plains. They are tourists with swords, walking through a land that feels both alien and oddly familiar. The atmosphere in Europe is shifting. The chivalric ideals of the past, where war was a gentleman's game of ransom and honour, are beginning to fray. At Sluys, there was no mercy. The archers did not care about the noble lineage of the men they shot. An arrow kills a duke just as dead as it kills a sailor. A new kind of ruthlessness is creeping into the world, a cold pragmatism that will define the coming century. The flower of chivalry is wilting, petal by petal, under the relentless efficiency of the longbow. As the sun sets on the era of naval warfare, the focus turns to the rolling hills and deep forests of northern France. Edward is planning something new, something audacious. He is done with sieges. He is done with waiting. He wants to draw the French out. He wants to sting them until they have no choice but to swat back. And so the ships are left behind, bobbing in the harbour, and the boots of the English army begin to tramp heavily on the dirt roads of Normandy. The air smells of rain and wet wool. The leaves are turning brown on the trees. And somewhere ahead, on a hillside near a village called Crécy, the destiny of nations is waiting to be written in the mud. The year is 1346, and the air in northern France tastes of smoke. King Edward III has returned, not with a fleet of ships to block a harbour, but with a torch to burn a path through the countryside. This is the strategy of chevauché, a ride of destruction designed not to capture land, but to break the spirit of the enemy. The English army moves like a plague of locusts across Normandy, burning villages, emptying granaries, and sending a plume of dark ash into the summer sky that can be seen for miles. It is a brutal, ugly form of warfare, intended to provoke the French king Philip VI into a rage. And it works. Philip gathers a massive host, an army so large that the ground shakes when it marches, and chases the English north toward the River Somme. For weeks, it is a deadly game of cat and mouse. Edward is running, looking for a way across the river, looking for a place to stand and fight on his own terms. His men are tired. Their boots are worn through, their bellies grumbling with the erratic rations of a marching army. But they are veterans now, hardened by the raids, and they trust their king. When they finally cross the Somme at a tidal ford, the water rising to their chests, they leave the pursuing French stranded on the other bank as the tide rushes back in. It is a narrow escape, a breath of air before the plunge. Edward does not run further. He finds a sloping hillside, near a small forest and a windmill, close to the village of Crécy-en-Ponthieu. He stops. He orders his men to eat, to rest, and to wait. He has chosen his ground. August 26th dawns hot and humid. The atmosphere is heavy, the kind of pressure that builds behind the eyes before a storm. The English army is small, perhaps 10 or 12,000 men, compared to the French force, which some chroniclers claim swells to 30,000 or more. But numbers in medieval warfare are slippery things, often inflated by excited monks writing centuries later. What matters is the geometry. Edward arranges his men in 3 solid blocks of dismounted knights and men-at-arms, bristling with lances, but the real teeth of his army are on the wings. There, standing in a jagged sawtooth formation, are the longbowmen. These are not noblemen, they are peasants, yeomen, smiths and farmers. And they wear simple padded jacks and iron helmets, and they carry bows made of yew that are taller than a man. They are the calmest men on the field. As the afternoon wears on, the sky begins to bruise. Dark, swollen clouds roll in from the coast, blotting out the sun. A flock of crows, disturbed by the thunder, wheels frantically over the battlefield, their caws mixing with the distant rumble of the approaching French army. And then the heavens open. Rain lashes down in a torrential sheet, turning the ploughed fields into a slick, clinging quagmire. The English archers, seasoned and practical, unstring their bows and tuck the hemp strings inside their helmets to keep them dry. It is a small detail, a piece of professional housekeeping that will decide the fate of thousands. The French army arrives in disarray. They have marched all day, hungry and eager. The nobles at the front see the English waiting on the hill and want to attack immediately. The king, Philip, tries to hold them back, to form up and wait for morning. But the French knights are proud, and pride is a difficult thing to steer. The commanders in the rear push forward, not wanting to be left out of the glory, shoving the vanguard closer and closer to the enemy. It is a traffic jam of egos. Seeing he has lost control, Philip orders the attack. First come the Genoese crossbowmen, mercenaries hired for their deadly accuracy. They march forward, shouting to intimidate the silent English lines. But they are tired. Their heavy shields are still in the baggage train miles behind, and crucially, their crossbow strings are soaked. Wet hemp stretches. When they raise their weapons to fire, the bolts fall short, thudding harmlessly into the mud. The English archers step forward. They retrieve their dry strings, string their bows with a practiced snap, and draw. What happens next is described by a chronicler as looking like snow. That is how thick the arrows are. A longbow arrow is a terrifying thing. a heavy shaft of asher oak, tipped with a bodkin point designed to punch through mail and padding. When thousands of them are loosed, at once the sound is not a twang, but a deep, vibrating hum, like the plucked string of a giant cello. The arrows slam into the Genoese. The mercenaries crumble, confused and panicked, and try to retreat. This is where the tragedy of Crécy turns into a massacre. The French knights, seeing the mercenaries retreat, do not see a tactical withdrawal, they see cowardice. In a blind rage, the French cavalry charges through their own crossbowmen. They trample their allies into the mud, cutting them down with swords as they ride, screaming insults at the useless hired help. It is a moment of horrific fratricide, a chaotic, bloody mess that slows the charge before it even reaches the English lines, and all the while the arrows keep falling. The English archers are machines. Draw, loose, knock, draw, loose, knock. They do not aim at individual men, they aim at the mass. The French horses, maddened by the stinging shafts, rear and buck, throwing their riders into the mud. Knights in heavy plate armour struggle to stand in the slick clay, only to be knocked down again by the press of fresh horses charging in from behind. The English men-at-arms stand firm, their lances creating a wall of steel, but they barely have to fight. The longbow is doing the work. In the centre of the chaos, a moment of poignant, tragic nobility unfolds. The blind King John of Bohemia is fighting on the French side. Hearing that the battle is joined, he refuses to sit in safety. He orders his knights to tie their horses' bridles to his, so they can guide him into the thick of the fight, where he can strike at least one blow. They oblige him. They ride together into the storm of arrows, a knot of chivalry bound by leather reins and doomed honour. They are found the next day, all dead, their horses still tied together, a grim monument to a code of conduct that is dying in real time. The sun sets, and the moon rises over a field of carnage. The French launch charge after charge, some say as many as 15, each one breaking against the English line like waves on a rocky shore. The flower of French nobility lies dead in the mud. The counts, the dukes, the grand names of the realm are silenced. King Philip himself, wounded in the jaw by an arrow and having had 2 horses killed under him, is finally dragged away from the field by his desperate bodyguards. He flees into the night, riding to a nearby castle. When he bangs on the gate, demanding entry, the castellan asks who is there. Philip replies, "Open." It is the fortune of France. The next morning, the fog lifts to reveal the scale of the devastation. The English walk among the dead, counting the heraldic surcoats. They find over 1,500 French lords and knights, and thousands more common soldiers. The English losses are absurdly light, perhaps a few hundred men. It is not just a defeat, it is a shock to the system of Europe. The idea that a peasant with a bow could kill a lord in armour was terrifying to the ruling classes. It upended the natural order. It suggested that war was no longer a sport for the wealthy, but a grim industrial business where efficiency mattered more than pedigree. Edward III walks the field, sober and victorious. He adopts the ostrich feather crest of the fallen blind King John, a symbol still used by the Prince of Wales today, honouring the bravery of his enemy even as he dismantles his kingdom. But Edward does not linger. He knows that a battle won is useless without a prize to hold. He turns his army north toward the coast. He needs a port. He needs a door into France that he can lock and unlock at will. He marches toward a city that will become the obsession of both kingdoms for the next year. He marches toward Calais. The road to Calais is open, but the war is far from over. The victory at Crécy has proven that the English can win a battle, but can they hold a country? The adrenaline of the charge is fading, replaced by the dull ache of marching boots. The English soldiers, their quivers empty and their arms sore, look toward the grey horizon of the Channel. They share a joke as they walk, muttering that the French knights are polite to a fault. They insist on dying in the exact order of their rank, just so the heralds don't get confused. It is a small laugh, dry as dust, but it keeps their feet moving. As the English army settles in around the walls of Calais, digging trenches and building huts for a long winter, the silence of the siege begins. This will not be a battle of arrows and charges. It will be a battle of wills, of hunger, and of the slow grinding passage of time. The screams of Crécy are gone, replaced by the hollow wind blowing off the sea, carrying the scent of salt and the impending rot of a city slowly starving to death. The victory at Crécy was a thunderclap, but the siege of Calais was a slow, strangling silence. As the autumn of 1346 turned into a biting winter, the war shifted from the frenetic energy of the battlefield to the grim, hollow-eyed patience of a blockade. Edward III did not attempt to storm the walls of Calais. He was too smart for that. The city was surrounded by marshes and sea, a natural fortress of water and stone that would have swallowed an assaulting army whole. Instead, he decided to wait. He built a city of his own outside the French gates, a sprawling encampment of wooden houses, thatched roofs, and cobbled streets that the soldiers wryly named Villeneuve-la-Hardie, or Brave New Town. It was a surreal mirror image. Inside the walls, a city dying; outside, a city thriving, complete with market days and butchers and merchants selling wool and wine. Inside Calais, the air grew stale and cold. The governor, Jean de Vienne, was a man of iron will, but will cannot fill a stomach. As the months dragged on, the food stores dwindled. First the grain ran out, then the livestock, then the horses, the dogs, and the cats. By spring, the citizens were boiling old leather boots and gnawing on rats, staring out from the ramparts at the English smoke rising lazily into the sky. It is in moments like these that the cruel mathematics of survival take over. In a desperate bid to save supplies for the soldiers, the governor made the agonizing decision to expel the useless mouths, the bouchers, inutiles. These were the old, the sick, the women, and the children. History tells us that in the early stages, Edward allowed a group of these refugees to pass through his lines, even giving them bread and a small coin each, a flicker of chivalry in a dark time. But as the siege hardened, that mercy evaporated. When a second group was forced out of the city gates later in the winter, the English refused to let them pass. The French refused to let them back in. Caught between the walls and the trenches, hundreds huddled in the freezing mud of the dry moat, starving to death within sight of both armies. It is a ghost story that still haunts the soil of Calais, a reminder that in war, the greatest suffering often falls on those who hold no weapon. Hope is a dangerous thing, and for the people of Calais, it arrived in the summer of 1347, only to break their hearts. King Philip VI finally appeared on the horizon with a relief army. The banners of France fluttered on the Sangatte hill, vibrant and promising against the grey sky. The starving citizens cheered, weeping with relief. But Philip looked down at the English fortifications. He saw the trenches, the palisades, and the fleet blocking the harbour. He did the medieval equivalent of checking his watch and remembering a prior engagement. Realising he could not attack without losing his own army, he turned around and marched away. The cheers on the walls died in throats parched by thirst. The silence that followed was heavier than any bombardment. With their king gone, Calais had no choice. Jean de Vienne signalled for parley. He offered to surrender the city if the lives of the citizens were spared. Edward, frustrated by the year-long delay and the cost of the siege, was in no mood for mercy. He demanded unconditional surrender, intending to put the population to the sword as a warning to other stubborn cities. But his own knights, men who had waded through blood at Crécy, balked. They argued that slaughtering a brave garrison was unknightly. It set a bad precedent. After all, they might be in a besieged castle some day. So Edward offered a compromise, a piece of theatre so dark it has become legendary. He would spare the city, but only if 6 of its most prominent citizens, the burghers, came out to him. They were to walk from the gates barefoot, bareheaded, dressed only in their shirts, with halters, heavy ropes used for hanging, already around their necks. They were to carry the keys to the city and the castle, and place their lives and their bodies at his absolute will. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine death sentence or a ritual of humiliation, a piece of diplomatic choreography designed to let Edward look powerful while allowing him to be merciful. But for the 6 men who volunteered, the terror was real. Eustache de Saint-Pierre, the wealthiest man in Calais, stood up first. "I have such a great hope of finding grace and pardon in the sight of our Lord," he said softly, "if I die to save this people." 5 others joined him. They stripped off their finery, the velvet and fur of their station, and put on the rough linen of the penitent. Imagine the scene as they walked out of the city gates. The ground was hard and cold under their bare feet. The English army stood in silence, thousands of eyes watching the procession. The wind whipped the thin shirts against their shivering bodies. When they reached the king's pavilion, they fell to their knees, offering the heavy iron keys to Edward. The English nobles, even the hardened Black Prince, were moved to tears by the dignity of these men, but Edward remained stone. He looked at them with cold blue eyes and ordered the executioner to step forward. "Cut off their heads," he commanded. The tension in the camp was palpable. Advisers whispered in the king's ear, begging him to reconsider. "Sire," one knight ventured, "you have a reputation for noble mercy. Do not stain it with this cruelty." Edward waved them away. He was the King of England, and he had been made to wait in the mud for a year. He wanted blood. Then a figure moved through the crowd. It was Queen Philippa. She was heavily pregnant, her belly swollen with the king's child. Throughout the war, she had been Edward's partner, a woman of immense strength and kindness, who had once rallied the English defence against the Scots while her husband was away. Now she knelt in the dirt before him, struggling with the weight of her unborn child. The court went deadly silent. It was one thing to ignore a knight, it was another to ignore the Queen. "My gentle lord," she said, her voice trembling but clear, "since I crossed the sea in great peril to see you, I have never asked you for any favour. But now I ask you, for the sake of the Son of the Virgin Mary, and for the love of me, that you will take mercy on these 6 men." Edward looked down at her. He looked at the 6 men, their heads bowed, the ropes rough against their necks. He looked at his soldiers, who were watching their king to see what kind of man he truly was. The silence stretched, long and agonizing, broken only by the snap of a banner in the wind. Finally the king's shoulders slumped. He let out a long sigh, perhaps realizing that executing these men would make him a monster, while sparing them would make him a legend. "Ah, lady," he said, shaking his head with a wry half-smile, "I wish you were anywhere else but here. You have stripped me of my vengeance, but I cannot refuse you. Take them. They are yours." The ropes were cut. The burghers were fed, clothed, and sent away with gifts. It was a triumph of mercy, or perhaps just excellent political theatre. But for Calais, the end was bittersweet. The lives were saved, but the city was lost. Edward ordered the French inhabitants to leave, all of them. He repopulated the town with English merchants and their families. For the next 200 years, Calais would be a slice of England on the French coast, a bustling port where the tavern keepers spoke with London accents and the ale was brewed the English way. The fall of Calais in 1347 marked the high water mark of Edward's early campaigns. He had destroyed the French fleet, crushed their army at Crécy, and now held the gateway to France. He was the most powerful monarch in Europe. His court was a glittering spectacle of tournaments and feasts, where knights reenacted the legends of King Arthur, convincing themselves that this golden age would last forever. But history has a way of humbling the proud. Just as England celebrated its invincibility, a ship docked in a southern port. It carried no soldiers, no weapons, and no declaration of war. It carried only a few sick rats and a handful of fleas. The greatest killer of the century had arrived, and it did not care about borders or kings or the colour of the flag flying over the castle. The war of men was about to be interrupted by the war of nature. History often focuses on the roar of battle, the clash of steel, and the thunder of charging horses. But the most significant event of the 100 Years' War did not happen on a battlefield. It arrived in silence, carried not by a knight in armour, but by a flea on the back of a black rat. It was the summer of 1348. The war had been raging for over a decade, and England was drunk on the victories of Crécy and Calais. King Edward III was planning his next move, and the French King Philip VI was desperately trying to rebuild his shattered army. But neither monarch knew that a conqueror far more ruthless than either of them had just docked on the southern coast of England. The ship arrived in the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. It looked like any other merchant vessel, perhaps carrying Gascon wine or fine cloth. But within days of its arrival, people in the town began to fall ill. It started with a headache, a fever, and a general feeling of malaise. Then came the tokens, dark, swollen lumps in the armpits and groin, hard as rocks and agonizingly painful. These were the buboes, the signature of the pestilence. Next came the black blotches on the skin, caused by bleeding under the surface. And finally, for many, came the coughing up of blood. Death usually followed within days, sometimes within hours. It was swift, it was ugly, and it was unstoppable. We know it now as the Black Death or Yersinia pestis. To the people of the 14th century, it was simply the Great Mortality. They did not understand germs or bacteria. They looked to the heavens and saw a punishment from God. They looked to the earth and blamed bad air or miasma, invisible, poisonous mists released by earthquakes or swamps. Doctors, helpless against the tide, prescribed strange remedies, carrying posies of sweet-smelling flowers to ward off the smell, drinking vinegar, or even lancing the boils to release the humours. Nothing worked. The disease swept north like a wildfire, moving along the trade routes that connected every village and town. The war ground to a halt. It was not a peace treaty that stopped the fighting. It was the sheer impossibility of gathering an army. When you gather thousands of men in a camp, you are creating a perfect breeding ground for disease. Soldiers deserted, not out of cowardice, but out of terror. Entire garrisons were wiped out before they could even draw their swords. In France, the devastation was apocalyptic. The kingdom was already reeling from military defeat and economic hardship. Now, the fields lay fallow because there was no one left to plough them. The grapes in the vineyards rotted on the vine because the harvesters were dead. Wolves, emboldened by the lack of human activity, began to roam the outskirts of Paris, their howls adding a feral soundtrack to the misery. One of the most poignant casualties of this time was not a soldier, but a princess. Edward III's daughter, Joan, was travelling to Spain to marry the heir to the Castilian throne, a strategic alliance to encircle France. She was young, beautiful, and the hope of her dynasty. When her entourage reached Bordeaux, the plague was already there. Her advisors begged her to leave, but it was too late. She contracted the disease and died within days. When the news reached Edward, the warrior king, who had watched men die by the thousands without flinching, was broken. He wrote a letter to the Spanish king, a rare glimpse into his heart. No fellow human being could be surprised if we were inwardly desolated by the sting of this bitter grief, for we are humans too. It was a stark reminder that the plague did not care about royal blood. As the months turned into years, the social fabric of Europe began to tear. The feudal system, which had held society together for centuries, relied on a simple equation. The few ruled the many, and the many worked the land in exchange for protection. But suddenly, the many were gone. In some regions, a third, perhaps even half of the population died. The survivors looked around and realized something revolutionary. Their labor was valuable. For the first time in history, a peasant could demand higher wages. If a lord refused, the peasant could simply walk to the next village where the desperate landowner would pay anything to get his harvest in. The ruling classes were terrified. They passed laws, like the Statute of Labourers in England, trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and forbidding peasants from moving. It was an attempt to legislate against the laws of supply and demand, and it was doomed to fail. The tension between the landowners and the newly empowered workers would simmer for decades, eventually erupting in the peasants' revolt. But in the immediate aftermath of the plague, it created a strange, surreal atmosphere. The survivors, flush with inherited money and clothes from their deceased relatives, began to dress above their station. A ploughman might be seen wearing a velvet doublet. A milkmaid might wear a silver belt. It was a dance macabre come to life, a society dancing on the edge of the grave, determined to enjoy what little time they had left. Historians still argue about the long-term psychological impact of the Black Death. Some say it made people more pious, driving them into the arms of the church. Others say it made them cynical, as they watched priests die just as quickly as sinners. We see this in the art of the time. The beautiful, serene statues of the high medieval period give way to grim skeletal figures. The three living and the three dead becomes a popular motif. Three young, healthy kings encountering three rotting corpses who whisper, "As you are, I once was. As I am, you will be." It was a heavy, melancholy wisdom that settled over the continent. By the early 1350s, the worst of the pandemic had passed. The frantic dying slowed. The mass graves were covered over with fresh earth and grass. But the Europe that emerged from the nightmare was different. It was smaller, quieter, and more sceptical. The population of France had plummeted. The tax base had collapsed. The armies that would eventually return to the field would be smaller, leaner, and more professional. The days of massive feudal levies were fading, replaced by bands of hardened mercenaries who fought for coin, not loyalty. And the war did return. The truce imposed by the plague was only a pause for breath. King Philip, the sixth of France, died in 1350, not of the plague but of old age, a rare feat in those days. He was succeeded by his son, John II, known as John the Good. Good in medieval terms often meant brave and chivalrous, which unfortunately for France usually translated to reckless and strategically inept. John was eager to prove himself, to wipe away the stain of Crécy and restore the honour of his house. He gathered his knights, dusted off the banners, and looked across the Channel. In England, Edward III was also restless. The plague had delayed his plans, but it had not changed his ambition. He still claimed the French crown, he still held Calais, and he had a new weapon, his son. Edward of Woodstock, known to history as the Black Prince, was coming of age. Tall, handsome, and terrifyingly competent, The prince was the perfect embodiment of the new war. He did not care for the old chivalry of ransom and polite exchange. He understood the lesson of the plague. Life is short, death is inevitable, and the only thing that matters is victory. As the 1350s wore on, the raids began again. The English launched a new chevauchée, this time deep into the heart of southern France. They moved fast, burning crops and seizing loot, moving like a darker, man-made version of the pestilence. They avoided the fortified cities and struck at the soft underbelly of the kingdom. The smoke rose once more, mixing with the memories of the pyres from the plague years. The stage was set for the next great collision. The French king, stung by the raids and desperate to catch the English prince, would make the same mistake his father made. He would chase the English, he would corner them, and he would force a battle on ground that was not his own. The ghost of Crécy was about to be resurrected, but this time the stakes would be even higher. The King of France would not just risk his army, he would risk his own person. So, take a deep breath. The air is clearing. The heavy, sickly, sweet scent of the plague years is fading, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of sharpened steel. The silence of the grave is broken by the sound of drums. The Black Prince is riding south, his black armour glinting in the sun, and the King of France is riding to meet him. The intermission is over. The tragedy continues. The year is 1356, and the sun over France is hot enough to bake the clay of the vineyards into brick. We are 10 years past the horror of Crécy, 10 years past the first wave of the plague, and yet the war has found its rhythm again. It is a rhythm of hoofbeats and smoke. The man conducting this symphony of destruction is Edward of Woodstock, the eldest son of King Edward III. History remembers him as the Black Prince, a name that sounds like it belongs to a villain in a fairy tale. In truth, no one called him that during his lifetime. The nickname likely came centuries later, perhaps referring to the colour of his armour, or more likely, the darkness of his reputation in France. To the French peasants, he was not a prince. He was a natural disaster in human form. He had spent the summer carving a path of ruin from the Atlantic coast deep into the heart of France, burning crops, sacking towns, and loading his wagons with so much looted silver, silk, and wine that his army moved with the sluggish pace of a glutton after a feast. But gluttony has its price. By September, the prince is trying to get back to the safety of English-held Bordeaux. He is tired, his men are sick with dysentery, and most dangerously, he is being hunted. King John II of France, John the Good, has gathered a massive army to cut him off. John is a man of immense personal bravery, the kind of king who looks great in a painting, but perhaps less so on a tactical map. He is determined not to repeat the mistakes of his father at Crécy. He has studied the English. He knows they like to fight on foot, using the terrain to break up cavalry charges. So, in a burst of logic that is both sound and disastrous, he decides that if the English fight on foot, the French will too. He orders his knights to send their horses to the rear. They will march into battle as infantry, encased in 60 pounds of plate armour under the blazing midday sun. It is a decision that historians still debate with a mix of fascination and frustration. Was it a tactical adaptation or simply a misunderstanding of why the English tactic worked? The two armies meet near the city of Poitiers, in a tangle of hedges and vineyards known as the field of Maupertuis. The English are cornered. They are outnumbered, perhaps 6,000 against the French king's 20,000. The Black Prince, pragmatic to the bone, actually tries to negotiate. He offers to return all the loot, release his prisoners, and promise not to fight against France for 7 years. It is a stunning offer, essentially a total surrender without the chains. But King John, smelling blood and glory, refuses. He demands the prince surrender himself as a hostage. That is a bridge too far. The prince looks at his exhausted men, looks at the sea of French banners fluttering in the distance, and decides that if they are to die, they will make such a ruin of the French army that the victory will taste like ash. The battle begins on a Monday morning, September 19th. The English have taken up a position on a slope, protected by a thick hedge with only a few gaps. It is a natural fortress. The French vanguard, the only part of their army still on horseback, charges first. They are meant to smash through the archers and clear the way for the dismounted knights, but the hedge is too thick and the gap is too narrow. As the French knights squeeze into the bottleneck, the English longbowmen step out from the cover of the vines. This time, however, the arrows do not bite as deeply as they did at Crécy. In the decade since that defeat, French armourers have been busy. They have reinforced the mail with solid plates of steel, deflecting the bodkin points, but an arrow does not need to kill a man to stop him, it just needs to kill his horse. The horses, maddened with pain, rear and thrash, blocking the narrow path and throwing their riders into the dust. The first charge is not just repelled, it is turned into a roadblock of dying animals and screaming men. Then comes the main event. The main body of the French army, thousands of knights on foot, begins the long march up the hill. Imagine walking a mile in a deep sea diving suit while someone throws rocks at you. That is the experience of the French nobility at Poitiers. They trudge through the mud, sweating, gasping for air, their boots slipping on the slick ground. By the time they reach the English lines, they are already exhausted. The clash of armies is often described as a single loud noise, but here it is a grinding, breathless shoving match. The English, rested and waiting, step forward to meet the winded French. The fighting is brutal, intimate and slow. Men hammer at each other with maces and axes, looking for a gap in the steel shell of their opponent. For hours, the battle hangs in the balance. The sheer weight of the French numbers begins to tell. The English line bends, buckles, but holds. The Black Prince is everywhere, his voice cutting through the din, encouraging his men, perhaps realizing that his life expectancy is measured in minutes. But then, a stroke of genius, or perhaps desperation, changes everything. The Prince spots a reserve force of French cavalry waiting in the rear. He gambles. He orders a small detachment of his own cavalry, led by the Captal de Buch, a Gascon nobleman, to circle around the flank and hit the French from behind. It works perfectly. The Captal's men charge into the rear of the French line, screaming and blowing trumpets to make themselves sound like a much larger force. Panic, the oldest enemy of armies, sweeps through the French ranks. They think they are surrounded. The discipline evaporates. The French divisions begin to crumble, turning to flee back down the hill. But in the centre of the collapse, one man refuses to move. King John II stands his ground. He is surrounded by enemies, his personal guard, dead or dying around him. He swings a heavy battle axe, cracking skulls and denting helmets, fighting with the fury of a man who knows he has lost his kingdom, but refuses to lose his pride. Beside him stands his youngest son, Philip, a boy of only 14. Philip does not run. He stays at his father's side, shouting warnings over the din of battle. Father, guard to the right. Father, guard to the left. It is a heartbreaking image of familial love in the midst of slaughter, a boy trying to protect his father from the inevitable. The English soldiers, realizing who he is, swarm around the king. They are not trying to kill him. A dead king is worth nothing, but a live king is a lottery ticket, worth a fortune. They shout at him to surrender, grabbing at his surcoat, arguing over who captured him first. Finally, a French knight who had been exiled and was fighting for the English pushes through the crowd. "Sire," he says, bowing low, "surrender to me." King John, exhausted, his axe lowered, looks around at the ruin of his army. He takes off his glove and hands it to the knight. The King of France is a prisoner. That night in the English camp, a scene unfolds that feels like it belongs in a romance novel rather than a history book. The Black Prince hosts a supper for the captured King John. He does not sit at the table with him. Instead, he waits on him, serving him food and pouring his wine with his own hands. He praises John's bravery, telling him that he fought better than any of his knights, and that valour does not always bring victory. It is the peak of chivalry, a polite, glittering facade over the brutal truth that France has just been decapitated. John sits there, dignified but surely in shock, eating the food of his conqueror while his own army lies dead in the fields outside. The capture of the king is a catastrophe for France. It is not just a military defeat. It is a political earthquake. The king is the state. Without him, the government is paralyzed. The Dauphin, Charles, is left to pick up the pieces, but he is young and untested. The peasants who have been taxed into poverty to pay for these disasters begin to mutter that the nobility has failed in its one job, protection. Why pay taxes to a knight who cannot even defend the king? The seeds of rebellion are being watered with the blood of Poitiers as the Black Prince marches his royal prisoner back to Bordeaux and then to London. The news spreads across Europe. The English are jubilant. They have captured the King of France. It seems as though the war is won. But victory in the 100 Years' War is a mirage. It shimmers, it beckons, and then it vanishes just when you reach for it. The English have the king, yes, but they do not have the kingdom. And as they will soon discover, holding a monarch for ransom is easier than holding a nation that is slowly, angrily waking up. The sun sets on the field of Poitiers, casting long shadows over the discarded shields and broken lances. The scavengers, both human and animal, begin to creep out from the edges of the woods. The glory of the day is fading into the cold reality of the night, and in the silence a new question begins to form. If the king is gone, who is France? The answer will not come from a battlefield, but from the streets of Paris and the peasant cottages of the countryside, where a different kind of war is about to begin. The year is 1360, and the war has paused, not because the hate has cooled, but because the sky itself has seemingly turned against the conquerors. King Edward III, the victor of Crécy, and the captor of the French king, is encamped outside the city of Chartres. He has spent the winter trying to march on Reims, to have himself crowned King of France, but the city gates remained shut, and the winter rains turned the roads into swamps. Now, on Easter Monday, a different kind of army attacks him. It is a storm of such violence that the chroniclers call it Black Monday. The sky turns an bruised, angry purple. Thunder shakes the earth like the footsteps of a giant. And then hail the size of goose eggs begins to fall. It is not just a weather event, it is a bombardment. Thousands of horses and nearly 1,000 English soldiers are killed, battered to death by the ice. To the medieval mind, this is not meteorology, it is theology. Edward, huddled in his tent as the canvas rips and the ice hammers against his armour, falls to his knees. He looks toward the spire of Chartres Cathedral, visible through the driving storm, and makes a vow to the Virgin Mary. He accepts the message. He will stop fighting. He will make peace. And so, in the village of Bretigny, a treaty is signed that is meant to end the 100 Years' War once and for all. It is a document of immense crushing victory for England. Edward III is given full sovereignty over nearly a third of France, a massive crescent-shaped kingdom stretching from the Pyrenees to the Loire, including the wealthy wine ports of Bordeaux and the fortress of Calais. In exchange, he agrees to a simple trade. He will renounce his claim to the French throne. He will stop calling himself King of France. It seems like a fair deal. He trades a title he can't enforce for land he can actually tax. For the French, the Treaty of Bretigny is a humiliation, a dismemberment of their country. But they have no choice. Their king, John II, is still a prisoner in London, living in a gilded cage at the Savoy Palace. The ransom set for his release is astronomical, 3 million gold écus. To put that in perspective, it is roughly equal to the entire government revenue of France for 2 years. The French peasants, already starving and broken by the plague, are squeezed even harder to pay for their king's freedom. It is said that payment became the most hated word in the French language. King John is eventually allowed to return to France to raise the rest of the money, leaving his 2 sons as hostages in London to guarantee his return. It is a standard arrangement in the Code of Chivalry, a gentleman's agreement between kings. But back in France, John finds a kingdom in ruins. The countryside is overrun not by English armies, but by something perhaps worse, the free companies. These are the soldiers left unemployed by the peace treaty. You see, when a war ends in the Middle Ages, the armies do not just go home. They are not standing armies with pensions and barracks. They are contractors. And when the contract ends, they are out of work. Thousands of English, Welsh, Gascon, and even French soldiers, men who know nothing but killing, suddenly find themselves without a paycheck. So they form gangs, they capture castles, hold towns for ransom, and terrorize the countryside. They are like a cancer that the treaty has unleashed. They call themselves the Great Company, and for the average French peasant, peace looks a lot like war, only without the banners. In the midst of this chaos, a scandal erupts that will define the character of King John forever. One of his sons, Louis of Anjou, who is being held hostage in English-controlled Calais, gets bored. He misses his wife, he misses the comforts of home, so he breaks his parole and escapes. He flees back to France, delighted with his own cleverness. King John is horrified. To him, honour is not just a word, it is the currency of a king. If a king's word is worthless, his kingdom is worthless. He convenes his council and announces something that shocks the pragmatists in his court. He says that if his son will not honour the agreement, he will. He announces that he will voluntarily return to captivity in England. His advisers beg him not to go. They tell him it is madness, that a king's duty is to rule, not to rot in a foreign prison for the sake of a promise. But John replies with a line that has echoed through history. If good faith were banished from the rest of the world, it should find a dwelling in the mouth of kings. And so, in the winter of 1364, the King of France packs his bags and sails back to London. He is greeted not as a prisoner, but as a guest of honour. The English, who love a grand gesture almost as much as they love a victory, throw him feasts and parades. He is the most popular man in London. But the winter is harsh and his health is failing. A few months after his return, John falls ill. He dies in the Savoy Palace, a king who chose honour over freedom, leaving his broken country in the hands of his son, Charles. The death of John II marks a turning point. The age of chivalry, with its grand gestures and blind charges, dies with him. His son, Charles V, is a very different kind of man. He is not a warrior, he is frail, prone to illness, and has a withered right hand that makes it impossible for him to wield a sword. His enemies call him a weakling, but history will call him Charles the Wise. Charles looks at the map of France, carved up by the Treaty of Bretigny, and he does not see a defeat. He sees a puzzle. He realizes that the English have made a fatal mistake. They have taken more land than they can possibly defend. England is a small island with a small population. France is vast. To hold Aquitaine, Normandy, and Calais requires garrisons, patrols, and money. Money that England does not have. Charles begins to rebuild the French state, not with battles, but with bureaucracy. He reforms the tax system, creating a steady stream of gold that does not depend on the whims of feudal lords. He hires a new kind of general, a Breton knight, named Bertrand du Guesclin. Du Guesclin is not a handsome prince. He is described by contemporaries as the ugliest man in Brittany, a short, squat figure with a face like a pugilist, but he possesses a genius for guerrilla warfare. Charles and du Guesclin devise a strategy that is revolutionary. They will not fight. They will refuse battle. When the English armies march out, expecting another Crécy or Poitiers, the French will simply disappear. They will retreat into fortified towns, burn the crops behind them, and let the English march through an empty, starving land. They will attack only when the English are tired, when they are crossing a river, or when they are asleep. It is a strategy of frustration, of denying the enemy the one thing he wants most, a glorious victory. Historians still debate whether the Treaty of Bretigny was a masterstroke or a trap for the English. On paper, it was the zenith of English power, but in reality, it overextended them. It gave them a vast empire that they had to govern, not just conquer. And governing a hostile population is a very different game from beating them in a field. As the 1360s wind down, the peace of Bretigny begins to fray. The English garrisons are isolated. The French are slowly, quietly rearming. The mood in Europe is shifting. The triumphant clarity of the earlier years, English longbows against French knights, is replaced by a murkier, grittier conflict. It is a war of sieges, of ambushes in the woods, of bribes and betrayals. The sun is setting on the generation of Edward III and the Black Prince. They are growing old. The prince, once the terror of France, is now sick, his body wasted by dysentery contracted in Spain. He rules his principality in Aquitaine from a sickbed, irritable and broke, taxing his subjects until they begin to look north to Paris for help. The lion is dying and the foxes are circling. So, let us rest here for a moment. In the uneasy quiet of the late 14th century, the maps have been redrawn, but the ink is not yet dry. The great storms have passed, but the air is still heavy with the promise of rain. The war is not over. It is merely catching its breath, changing its shape, and preparing for a new kind of king to take the stage. By the late 1360s, the sun that had shone so brightly on English victories was beginning to set, not in a blaze of glory, but in the long grey shadows of attrition. The great warriors of the earlier generation were fading. King Edward III was sinking into a senile twilight, his mind clouded, his court dominated by his mistress, Alice Perrers. The Black Prince, once the terrifying embodiment of English martial prowess, was a swollen, irritable invalid, ruling his principality of Aquitaine from a sick bed, his body wasted by dysentery contracted during a disastrous campaign in Spain. The English lion was old, sick, and losing its teeth. And across the border, the French fox was waking up. King Charles V of France, known as the Wise, was the antithesis of his father and grandfather. He was not a warrior king who charged into battle. He was a scholar king who sat in his library in the Louvre, surrounded by astrologers and manuscripts. He was physically frail, prone to illness, and possessed a withered right hand that made it impossible for him to wield a sword. But he understood something that his predecessors had missed. War is not about battles. It is about money, logistics, and psychology. He looked at the map of France, carved up by the Treaty of Bretigny, and saw not a defeat, but an opportunity. The English were overextended. They held vast territories they could barely afford to garrison. Their subjects in Aquitaine were groaning under heavy taxes to pay for the Black Prince's lavish court. Charles began his reconquest not with an army, but with a lawyer. In 1368, the Count of Armagnac, a disgruntled vassal of the Black Prince, appealed to Charles V against the prince's heavy taxation. Technically, under the Treaty of Bretigny, Charles had no jurisdiction over Aquitaine, but Charles, sensing the weakness of his enemy, accepted the appeal. He summoned the Black Prince to Paris to answer the charges. The prince, furious at the insult, replied with the last flash of his old fire, "I will come to Paris, but it will be with helmet on head and 60,000 men at my back." It was a brave threat, but an empty one. The war resumed in 1369, but this time the English found themselves fighting a ghost. Charles V had appointed a new constable of France, a Breton knight named Bertrand du Guesclin. Du Guesclin was an unlikely hero. Short, squat, and famously ugly, the ugliest man in Brittany, they called him. He was a marked contrast to the tall, handsome Plantagenets, but he was a genius of irregular warfare. He understood that the English longbow was deadly only if the English could force a set-piece battle, so he refused to give them one. The strategy was simple and maddening. When the English launched their traditional chevauchées, burning villages and marching through the countryside in search of a fight, the French armies simply melted away. They retreated into fortified towns and castles, stripping the land of food and supplies. The English marched through empty fields, their supply lines stretching thin, their soldiers falling sick from hunger and disease. And Du Guesclin's men would then strike at the stragglers, ambush foraging parties, and retake isolated castles by night. It was a war of Fabian tactics, wearing the enemy down through delay and harassment rather than confrontation. One of the most dramatic moments of this phase came in 1370 at the sack of Limoges. The city had surrendered to the French, enraging the sick Black Prince. He had himself carried on a litter to the walls, ordering his men to storm the town. What followed was a massacre. The chronicler Froissart describes men, women, and children throwing themselves at the prince's feet, begging for mercy. But he was so inflamed with ire that he took no heed of them. More than 3,000 civilians were slaughtered. It was a brutal act of vengeance that stained the prince's reputation forever, transforming him from a chivalric hero into a cruel tyrant in the eyes of the French people. It was also his last act of war. Broken in body and spirit, he returned to England to die, leaving the defence of Aquitaine to his brothers. Year by year, castle by castle, the English tide receded. The French reconquest was slow, unglamorous, and relentless. There were no great battles to sing about, no fields of glory like Crécy or Poitiers, just a steady erosion of English power. By 1375, the English held only a few coastal enclaves, Calais, Bordeaux, and Bayonne. The vast territories won by Edward III had evaporated like morning mist. The wise king had won back his kingdom without fighting a single major battle. But victory in the Middle Ages was a fragile thing, often dependent on the lifespan of a single man. In 1380, disaster struck France. Charles V died at the age of 42, leaving the throne to his son, Charles VI, a boy of 11. And almost simultaneously, Bertrand du Guesclin died of illness while besieging a castle. France had lost its brain and its sword in the same year. Across the Channel, England was also undergoing a generational shift. The Black Prince had died in 1376, followed closely by his father, Edward III, in 1377. The crown passed to the Black Prince's son, Richard II, who was also just a boy, 10 years old. So, as the 1380s dawned, both kingdoms were ruled by children. This created a dangerous vacuum. In England, the young Richard II faced a kingdom in turmoil. The cost of the failed wars had led to the introduction of the poll tax, a deeply unpopular levy that sparked the peasants' revolt of 1381. For a terrifying few days, London was in the hands of a mob led by Wat Tyler. They burned the Savoy Palace, beheaded the Archbishop of Canterbury, and demanded the end of serfdom. The young king, showing immense courage, rode out to meet the rebels at Smithfield. When Tyler was killed in a scuffle, the mob prepared to charge. Richard, only 14, rode toward them shouting, "I will be your captain. Follow me." He diffused the revolt, but the trauma of those days would haunt his reign. In France, the situation was equally unstable. The young Charles VI was initially popular, handsome, and eager. They called him Charles the Beloved. He dreamed of invading England, even assembling a massive fleet in 1386, a wooden wall of ships designed to carry a prefabricated wooden fortress across the Channel. But like so many invasion plans before and after, it was defeated by the weather and the indecision of his uncles, who were more interested in looting the treasury than fighting the English. Then, in 1392, something happened that would plunge France into its darkest hour. It was a hot August day. Charles VI was riding through the forest of Le Mans on a military expedition. He was already feeling unwell, feverish, and agitated. Suddenly, a wild-looking man in rags rushed out of the woods, grabbed the king's bridle, and screamed, "Ride no further, noble king! Turn back! You are betrayed!" The guards chased the man away, but the king was visibly shaken. A few hours later, as the heat intensified, a page accidentally dropped a lance onto a helmet. The sharp clang of metal on metal snapped something in the king's mind. He drew his sword, shouted, "Forward against the traitors," and charged his own men. He killed 4 of his own knights before he was overpowered and tied to a wagon. When he woke up, he remembered nothing. It was the first attack of a madness that would plague Charles VI for the rest of his life. Historians now believe he likely suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, possibly exacerbated by encephalitis. His lucid intervals grew shorter and shorter. During his fits, he would forget his name, refuse to wash or change his clothes for months, and sometimes believe he was made of glass, terrified that he would shatter if touched. He would run through the corridors of his palace, howling like a wolf, while his wife and courtiers looked on in horror. This glass king left a power vacuum that tore France apart. 2 rival factions emerged to control the mad monarch, and by extension, the kingdom. On one side were the Armagnacs, led by the Count of Armagnac and the king's brother, Louis of Orléans. On the other were the Burgundians, led by the king's cousin, John the Fearless, the powerful Duke of Burgundy. The rivalry turned bloody in 1407. On a dark Paris street, Louis of Orléans was ambushed by masked assassins as he left the Queen's residence. His hand was hacked off, the hand that had allegedly fondled the Queen, and his skull was split open. The assassins left him dying in the gutter. A few days later, John the Fearless admitted to the murder, claiming it was a tyrannicide for the good of the realm. Civil war erupted. The Armagnacs and Burgundians fought each other with a savagery that made the war with England look like a gentleman's duel. Paris became a battleground of riots and massacres. The butchers of Paris, supporting the Burgundians, slaughtered Armagnac supporters in the streets. France was effectively 2 countries, paralysed by hatred, and watching from across the Channel was a new English king. Henry V had taken the throne in 1413. He was young, scarred from battle. He carried an arrow scar on his face from the Battle of Shrewsbury, and fiercely pious. He looked at the chaos in France, a mad king, a civil war, a divided nobility, and saw the hand of God inviting him to intervene. He did not just want to regain the lost lands of Aquitaine, he wanted the crown itself. He believed with a cold, terrifying certainty that he was the rightful king of France and that God had appointed him to punish the French for their sins, the eagle was poised to strike at the wounded fox. The intermission of truces and minor skirmishes was over. The most famous, and perhaps the most miraculous, chapter of the war was about to begin. Henry gathered his ships, he pawned his jewels, he hired archers, and in the summer of 1415 he set sail for Normandy, determined to finish what Edward III had started. The stage was set for Agincourt. The year 1415 opens with the kingdom holding its breath, the silence in the English court broken only by the scratching of quills and the sharpening of iron. King Henry V is not like the kings who came before him. He is not the jovial, bankrupt dreamer that his father was, nor the senile shadow of his grandfather. He is 28 years old with a face marked by a terrible scar from an arrow that nearly killed him in his youth, a constant reminder that death is always an inch away. He is a man of cold, terrifying piety. He does not drink to excess. He does not keep mistresses. He attends Mass 3 times a day. He believes with a burning, diamond-hard conviction that he is God's instrument, sent to punish the sins of France and reclaim what is rightfully his. Across the Channel, France is a body without a head. King Charles VI is locked in the grip of his madness, howling in the corridors of his palace, convinced he is made of glass. The vacuum of power has sucked the nobility into a civil war so vicious it has paralyzed the nation. The Armagnacs and the Burgundians are too busy murdering each other in the streets of Paris to notice the storm gathering on the coast. When Henry's fleet of 1,500 ships appears in the mouth of the Seine in August, the French response is not a roar of defiance, but a confused murmur. There is no royal army waiting on the beach. There is only the quiet lapping of waves and the sound of English boots hitting the sand near the port of Harfleur. Henry's plan is simple: capture Harfleur, use it as a base, and then march on Paris. But medieval warfare mocks simple plans. Harfleur is well fortified, surrounded by flooded marshes and high walls. The English settle in for a siege, expecting it to last a few weeks. Instead, it drags on for a month in the suffocating heat of late summer. The air in the camp turns stagnant, the latrines overflow, and then the bloody flux dysentery strikes. It is a killer far more efficient than the French garrison. Men begin to die by the hundreds, their bodies wasted by fever and dehydration. The king watches as his great army, the force that was supposed to conquer France, dissolves into a hospital ward. Earls, bishops, and archers alike are buried in shallow graves in the soft mud. When Harfleur finally surrenders on September 22nd, it is a hollow victory. The English flag flies over the city, but at a terrible cost. Henry has lost a third of his army to disease. The season for campaigning is over. The autumn rains are starting. His advisors beg him to sail home, to return to England and rebuild his strength for next year. But Henry V is not a man who turns back. To retreat now would look like failure. It would look like God had withdrawn his favour. So, he makes a decision that seems, to many, like madness. He announces that he will march his remaining force, barely 6,000 men, mostly archers, across 150 miles of hostile French territory to the English stronghold of Calais. It is not a military manoeuvre, it is a statement of faith. He is daring the French to stop him. He sends a letter to the French Dauphin, challenging him to single combat to decide the war and spare the blood of their people. The Dauphin does not reply. The march begins in October. It is a nightmare from the start. The English soldiers are sick, hungry, and carrying only what they can put on their backs. They march through driving rain, their boots sinking into the clay, their clothes rotting on their bodies. They are not conquerors. They are a ragged band of survivors trying to get to a lifeboat. And now, finally, the French wake up. The shock of the fall of Harfleur shakes the Armagnacs and Burgundians out of their stupor just enough to agree on a truce. They issue a semence des nobles, a summons to arms. From every corner of France, the chivalry rides out. Dukes, counts, barons, and knights, tens of thousands of them, converge to crush the insolent English king. They shadow Henry's army, moving parallel to him on the other side of the river Somme, guarding every bridge and ford. For days, Henry plays a deadly game of cat and mouse, marching upstream, looking for a crossing. He finds the bridges broken or heavily guarded. His men are eating berries and raw nuts. They are drinking river water, which only fuels the dysentery. The French taunt them from the far bank, shouting that they will cut off the archers' fingers so they can never draw a bow again. It is psychological torture. The English are trapped against the river, with the ocean to their backs and a massive army in front of them. Then a miracle, or perhaps just luck. Near the village of Betancourt, they find a causeway through the marshes that the French have neglected to guard. It is narrow and broken, but it is enough. In a single frantic night, the English army slips across the Somme. They are now on the same side of the river as the French. The road to Calais is open, but blocking it is the French host. On the 24th of October, near a small village called Agincourt, or Azincourt to the locals, the scouts ride back to Henry with grim news. The French army is ahead, and it is massive. Contemporary accounts vary wildly, but modern estimates suggest the French outnumber the English at least 5-1, perhaps more. They are fresh, well-fed, and heavily armoured. The English are starving, sick, and exhausted. That night, the two armies camp within earshot of each other. The contrast is painful. On the French side, the air is filled with the sounds of confidence. Knights shouting for their squires, horses neighing, the clatter of wine cups, and the boasting of men who have already spent the ransom money of the prisoners they intend to take. They play dice for the English lords. They paint their banners. They are so sure of victory that some of them even construct a special cart, painted and gilded, to carry the captured King Henry to Paris. On the English side, there is silence. Henry has ordered that any man who makes a noise will lose his horse or his ears. The priests move among the men, hearing confessions. The soldiers sit in the mud, fletching their arrows, sharpening their swords, and chewing on the last of their leather rations. They know they are going to die. It is a mathematical certainty. They are surrounded, outnumbered, and weak. The rain begins to fall again, a cold, relentless drizzle that turns the newly ploughed field between the two armies into a soup of heavy clay. In the king's tent, Henry is awake. He knows that his gamble has failed. He has led his men into a trap, but he does not show fear. He speaks to his captains with a quiet, icy calm. When one night Sir Walter Hungerford wishes aloud that they had 10,000 more bold archers from England, Henry rebukes him. "I would not have a single man more," he says. "If we are marked to die, we are enough to do our country loss. And if to live, the fewer men, the greater share of honour." It is the speech that Shakespeare would later turn into poetry, but the sentiment is real. Henry believes that God will decide the battle, not numbers. As the dawn of St. Crispin's Day approaches, the rain stops, but the ground is ruined. It is a quagmire of sticky, knee-deep mud. The English archers, shivering in their rags, stand up and stretch their stiff limbs. They reach for their bows, their crooked sticks of yew. They have no armour. Many of them are barefoot. Some, suffering from the flux, have cut the backs out of their breeches so they can relieve themselves without stopping the fight. They look across the field. The French are arrayed in 3 massive lines, a wall of steel and colour. The flower of French nobility is there. The Constable of France, the Dukes of Orléans, Bourbon, and Alençon. They are jostling for position in the front row, eager for the glory of the charge. They look at the small, pathetic band of English and see a nuisance to be swept away, not an enemy to be feared. Henry orders his men to form up. He places the men-at-arms in the centre and the archers on the wings, in a wedge formation. Then he does something unexpected. He orders the whole line to advance. They move forward, trudging through the mud, until they are within bowshot, about 300 yards, of the French. The English stop. The archers hammer long, sharpened wooden stakes into the ground in front of them, pointing outward at an angle, a primitive tank trap designed to impale charging horses. Then a single voice cries out, "Now strike!" The English archers draw their bows. The air fills with that terrifying familiar hum. The first volley flies. It is not a cloud this time. It is a horizontal sleet of iron. The arrows strike the French helmets and breastplates with a sound like 1,000 hammers hitting 1,000 anvils. The French, stung and furious, lower their visors. The Constable of France orders the charge. "Forward!" The earth trembles. The French cavalry begins to move, but the mud sucks at the horses' hooves. The charge is slow, heavy, and lumbering. And as they advance, the English arrows begin to find the gaps, the islets, the armpits, the unprotected chests of the horses. The animals scream and panic, turning sideways, crashing into each other. The orderly lines of the French chivalry begin to knot and tangle. The trap is sprung. The madness of kings has led them here, to a muddy field in northern France, where pride is about to meet physics. The English are not fighting a battle. They are feeding a machine, and the machine is hungry. The air above Agincourt vibrated with a sound like tearing canvas as thousands of arrows left the English yew-boughs. It was not a single volley, but a continuous, rhythmic storm. The French vanguard, composed of heavy cavalry, lowered their heads against the iron rain. They expected the arrows to bounce off their plate armour, and many did, sparking and clattering harmlessly. But the horses were different. An arrow in the flank or the chest of a charger sends the animal into a panic. The first line of the French attack did not crash into the English stakes. It dissolved into a screaming, thrashing knot of horseflesh. Wounded beasts bolted backward, crashing into the advancing infantry behind them, trampling their own men in the churned-up clay. This was the first disaster. The second was the terrain. The field of Agincourt was shaped like a funnel, narrowing toward the English end. As the massive French army pressed forward, shoulder to shoulder, they were squeezed tighter and tighter. The men on the flanks naturally pushed inward to avoid the English arrows compressing the centre until the knights in the middle could barely move their arms. It was a crush of unimaginable density. Men in 60 pounds of plate armour, already exhausted from the slog through knee-deep mud, found themselves trapped in a standing press of steel. Then the main French battle line arrived. These were dismounted knights, the cream of the nobility, determined to fight on foot as their fathers had at Poitiers. But the mud was their enemy. They slipped and stumbled, their heavy sabatons sinking deep into the clay with every step. By the time they reached the English line, they were gasping for breath. The English men-at-arms, standing firm and rested, simply stepped forward and knocked them over. It is a terrifying myth of medieval warfare that a knight in armour who falls cannot get up. On firm ground, a fit man can spring to his feet easily, but in the deep, clinging mud of Agincourt, with the weight of other bodies pressing down on top of you, falling was a death sentence. Men did not die from sword cuts, they drowned in the mud. They suffocated inside their own helmets, crushed by the press of the crowd. The chroniclers speak of heaps of dead and dying, piles of humanity rising as high as a man's head. And then the unthinkable happened. The English archers having loosed their last arrows, did not retreat. They dropped their bows. They drew swords, axes, and heavy lead mallets, tools used for driving stakes. Lightly armoured and unburdened by heavy plate, they swarmed over the piles of French knights like hornets. They were agile in the mud, where the French were clumsy. They scrambled over the dead to strike at the living, driving daggers through visors and hammering on helmets until the occupants surrendered or ceased to move. It was not a battle of chivalry. It was a slaughter in a pigsty. In the middle of the chaos, King Henry fought like a man possessed. He stood over the body of his brother, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, defending him from a circle of French knights. A blow from an axe sheared off a piece of Henry's crown, denting his helmet and nearly ending the English monarchy right there in the sludge, but he stayed on his feet. The French, despite their numbers, were paralysed by the crush. They could not swing their weapons, they could only wait to be killed or captured. By the afternoon, the fighting had stabilised. The English had taken thousands of prisoners, dukes, counts, and wealthy knights who would fetch enormous ransoms. They were herded to the rear, stripped of their helmets and weapons, exhausted and terrified. Victory seemed certain, but then a cry went up. A new French force was seen gathering on the horizon for a fresh charge, and simultaneously news arrived that the local French peasants had raided the English baggage train in the rear, stealing the king's crown jewels and sword. Henry looked at his exhausted, outnumbered army. He looked at the thousands of prisoners in the rear, men who, though disarmed, still outnumbered their captors and could easily pick up a weapon from the ground if a new attack began. In that moment, the cold logic of survival overrode the code of chivalry. Henry gave an order that still chills historians today. Kill the prisoners. The English knights refused. It was against their honour, and frankly, it was burning money. These men were worth fortunes in ransom. So Henry turned to his archers. These men, commoners who had no concept of knightly codes and who knew that if the battle turned, they would be killed without mercy, obeyed. They moved among the prisoners with knives and axes. It was a grim, mechanical butchery. Men who had shared wine and conversation with their captors moments before were cut down where they stood. The slaughter stopped only when it became clear that the new French attack was a feint. The gathering force on the hill, seeing the pile of bodies, melted away. But the damage was done. The field was silent, save for the groans of the dying and the squelch of boots in the bloody mud. The flower of French nobility lay dead. The Constable of France, the Admiral, the Dukes of Alençon, Brabant, and Bar, all gone. Henry summoned the French heralds, who had watched the battle from a nearby hill to record the outcome. He asked them the name of the castle that stood nearby. Agincourt, they replied. Then, said the king, let this battle be known as the Battle of Agincourt. The numbers were staggering. The French had lost perhaps 6,000 men, arguably more. The English losses were absurdly low. Historians debate the figure, but it was likely between 100 and 600 men. It was a miracle. It was an impossibility. It was, in Henry's eyes, the final judgment of God. The army marched on to Calais, but they were too exhausted to capitalise on the victory immediately. They sailed home to London, where Henry was greeted with a rapture usually reserved for saints. The people rushed into the water to drag his ship to shore. The fountains ran with wine, but Henry, ever the pious enigma, refused to let the bards sing songs about him. He ordered that all glory be given to God alone. He wore a simple gown, refusing to display his battered helmet or the dented crown to the crowds. It was a masterstroke of humility that only burnished his legend further. But Agincourt was not the end of the war. It was the key that unlocked the door. The French resistance was shattered. the psychological blow was total. The Armagnacs and Burgundians, instead of uniting against the invader, blamed each other for the defeat. The civil war intensified. John the Fearless, the Duke of Burgundy, seeing the way the wind was blowing, began to negotiate with Henry. In 1417, Henry returned. This time he did not come for a raid, he came to stay. He brought a methodical, grinding war of sieges. He took Caen, Rouen, and eventually Paris itself. The French king, Charles VI, was now completely incapacitated by his madness. His wife, Queen Isabeau, famously pragmatic and perhaps a little vindictive toward her own son, the Dauphin, agreed to deal with the English. The result was the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. It was the document that finally, legally, gave England everything it had fought for since 1337. Henry V was to marry Catherine of Valois, the daughter of the French king. He was named the heir to the French throne. When the mad king Charles VI died, Henry would become King of France. The Dauphin, Charles, was declared a bastard and disinherited, banished to the provinces south of the Loire. It was the apex of English power. A dual monarchy was created on parchment. Henry V, the warrior king, had done what Edward III could not. He had united the two crowns. He entered Paris not as a conqueror, but as a regent, riding alongside the mad king. The University of Paris and the States General ratified the treaty. It seemed that the war was finally, truly over. England had won. But fate has a cruel sense of timing. The treaty relied on one thing: Henry V outliving the sickly old French king. Henry was in his prime, a warrior of 34. Charles VI was a wreck. The odds were good. But in 1422, while campaigning to crush the last pockets of resistance from the disinherited Dauphin, Henry contracted dysentery again, the same disease that had nearly destroyed his army at Harfleur. He died at the Château de Vincennes on August 31st, 1422. He was just 35 years old. His son, Henry VI, was an infant, only 9 months old. 2 months later, the mad king Charles VI of France finally died. And so, the dual monarchy of England and France, the greatest empire in Western Europe, was inherited by a baby. The King of England and France was a child who could not even hold a rattle, let alone a scepter. The immense personal authority of Henry V, the glue that held the conquest together, vanished overnight. The English regents, led by Henry's capable brother, the Duke of Bedford, tried to hold the line. They continued the war, pushing south against the Dauphin's forces. They were winning. They laid siege to the city of Orléans, the key to the south. If Orléans fell, the Dauphin would be crushed and the conquest would be complete. The English commanders were confident. They built a ring of forts around the city. They waited for hunger to do its work, but in the quiet darkness of a village called Domremy, on the borders of Lorraine, a 13-year-old girl was beginning to hear voices. They were not the voices of kings or generals. She said they were the voices of St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret. And they were telling her something impossible, that she, a peasant who could not read or ride a horse, was chosen by God to drive the English out of France and crown the Dauphin. The miracle of Agincourt was about to meet the miracle of the Maid. The pendulum of history, having swung so violently toward England, was pausing, trembling, and preparing to swing back. The Treaty of Troyes, signed in 1420, was the zenith of English ambition. It was a masterpiece of diplomacy carved out by the sword of Henry V. On parchment, it erased the independent kingdom of France. Henry was married to Catherine of Valois, the daughter of the mad king Charles VI, and declared the heir to the French throne. The Dauphin, the future Charles VII, was disinherited, declared a bastard, and banished to the provincial obscurity of Bourges, When Henry rode into Paris, he did not ride as a conqueror, but as a regent and heir apparent, side by side with the failing French king. The university, the parliament, and the exhausted citizens of Paris welcomed him. They were tired of civil war, tired of the Armagnacs and Burgundians slaughtering each other in the streets. They wanted peace, even if it spoke English. But history is cruel to paper triumphs. The entire structure of this dual monarchy rested on the life of one man, Henry V. He was 35 years old, a hardened warrior in his prime. Charles VI was a shattered old man in his 50s. The actuarial tables were heavily in Henry's favour. But in August 1422, while campaigning to crush the last resistance of the Dauphin, Henry contracted dysentery, the same bloody flux that had plagued his army at Harfleur. He died at the Château de Vincennes, leaving his empire to a 9-month-old baby, Henry VI. 2 months later, the mad king Charles VI finally died. Suddenly, the King of France and England was an infant who could not even lift his own head, let alone a crown. The regency of France fell to Henry V's brother, John, Duke of Bedford. Bedford was a capable, intelligent man, perhaps the best administrator England ever produced. He ruled from Paris with a firm but fair hand, trying to knit the two kingdoms together. He continued the war, pushing south against the Dauphin, who was now mockingly called the King of Bourges. The English strategy was methodical. They captured town after town, fortress after fortress, slowly squeezing the life out of the resistance. By 1428, the English were ready for the final blow. They marched on Orléans. This city was the key to the south. It sat on the Loire River, the last natural barrier protecting the Dauphin's makeshift capital. If Orléans fell, the French cause was lost. The English commander, the Earl of Salisbury, surrounded the city with a ring of forts. He did not have enough men to fully encircle the walls, so he built a series of bastilles, small fortified strongholds, to block the roads and starve the defenders. Inside Orléans, the mood was grim. The garrison was commanded by the bastard of Orléans, Jean de Dunois, a brave and capable soldier, but he was outnumbered and cut off. The citizens watched as the English noose tightened. They sent desperate pleas to the Dauphin, but Charles was paralysed by indecision and poverty. He had no money to raise a relief army. His courtiers whispered that he should flee to Scotland or Spain. France was dying, not with a bang, but with a whimper. But in the quiet village of Domremy, on the edge of the contested lands of Lorraine, something impossible was happening. A peasant girl named Jehanne, in the dialect of her people, was hearing voices. She was 13 years old, illiterate, and by all accounts, intensely pious. She claimed that St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret spoke to her in her father's garden. At first, they told her to be good and go to church, but as she grew older, the voices became more urgent. They told her that she, a girl who had never held a sword, was chosen by God to save France. "I am a poor girl. I do not know how to ride or fight," she replied to the voices. But they were insistent. "Go, daughter of God, go." In early 1429, Joan left her village. She travelled to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs and demanded that the garrison commander, Robert de Baudricourt, take her to the Dauphin. He laughed at her. He told her cousin to take her home and beat her. But she refused to leave. She slept in the stables, attended Mass every day, and spoke with such conviction that the people of the town began to believe her. Finally, worn down by her persistence and the growing legend around her, Baudricourt gave her a sword and an escort of a few soldiers. She cut her hair short, dressed in men's clothes for safety, and rode through enemy territory to the Dauphin's court at Chinon. The meeting between Joan and Charles VII is one of the most mythologized moments in history. The legend says that Charles, wanting to test her, hid himself among his courtiers, while a lesser noble sat on the throne. When Joan entered the great hall, she ignored the impostor and walked straight to Charles, kneeling before him. "God give you life, gentle king," she said. Charles was sceptical. He was a man plagued by doubt about his legitimacy, his sanity, given his father's madness, and his ability to rule. He had her examined by theologians to ensure she was not a witch or a heretic. They found nothing but humility, virginity, devotion, honesty, and simplicity. Desperate, with Orléans on the verge of surrender, Charles decided to take a gamble. He gave this teenage girl a suit of white armour, a banner embroidered with the lice of France, and command of an army. It was an act of desperation that looked like madness, but it changed everything. Joan did not fight like a general. She fought like a symbol. She banned swearing and prostitutes from the camp. She forced the rough mercenaries to confess their sins, and she led from the front. When she arrived at Orléans in April 1429, she did not wait for the English to starve. She attacked. She dictated a letter to the English commanders, demanding they leave France. King of England, and you, Duke of Bedford, who call yourself regent of the kingdom of France, surrender to the maid sent hither by God, the King of Heaven, the keys of all the good towns which you have taken and violated in France. The English laughed. They called her a cowgirl and a whore, but the laughter died quickly. On May 4th, Joan led an attack on the English fort of Saint-Lô. She rode into the thick of the fighting, her banner held high, rallying the flagging French troops. They took the fort. 3 days later, she attacked the main English stronghold, the Tourelle, at the end of the bridge across the Loire. During the assault, an arrow struck her in the shoulder, piercing her armour and flesh. She fell. The English cheered, thinking the witch was dead. But Joan pulled the arrow out herself, had the wound dressed with olive oil and lard, and returned to the fight. The sight of this girl, bleeding but unbowed, returning to the field was too much for the English. They panicked. The French, energized by what they saw as a miracle, surged forward. The Tourelles fell. The English commander, Glassdale, drowned in the river as the bridge collapsed under the weight of his retreating men. On May 8th, the English army, demoralized and defeated, lifted the siege and marched away. In just 9 days, a peasant girl had done what the entire French army had failed to do for months. Orléans was saved. The bells of the city rang out, and the people crowded around Joan, trying to touch her horse or her boots as if she were a living saint. She was 17 years old, but Joan was not done. She told Charles that her mission was not just to save Orléans, but to crown him King of France in the Cathedral of Reims. This seemed impossible. Reims was deep in English-held territory. The road was blocked by English garrisons. But Joan insisted. "I shall last a year, and but little longer," she said. "We must think of toils." The campaign that followed was a blitzkrieg. The French army, now believing they were on a divine mission, swept through the Loire Valley. They crushed the English at the Battle of Patay, where the legendary English longbowmen were caught by a French cavalry charge before they could plant their stakes. It was the reverse of Agincourt. The English were routed. The road to Reims was open. On July 17th, 1429, in the great cathedral of Reims, with the stained glass casting pools of coloured light on the stone floor, Charles VII was anointed with the holy oil and crowned King of France. Joan stood beside him, holding her banner. It was the moment of supreme triumph. The King of Bourges was now the true anointed King of France. The legitimacy that the English had tried to steal with the Treaty of Troyes was reclaimed, but as the holy oil dried on Charles's forehead, the political realities began to close in. Joan wanted to march on Paris immediately. She believed God was with them and that they should not stop until the English were driven into the sea. But Charles was hesitant. He was a cautious man. Preferring negotiation to battle, he began to listen to his advisers, who were jealous of Joan's influence and weary of her aggressive tactics. They signed truces with the Duke of Burgundy, stalling the advance. Joan's momentum began to stall. An attack on Paris in September failed. Joan was wounded again, this time by a crossbow bolt to the thigh, and had to be dragged away from the walls by her soldiers. Charles ordered a retreat. The miracle was beginning to look like a military campaign again, with all its messy compromises and failures. In the spring of 1430, Joan went to Compiègne to defend the town against a Burgundian siege. On May 23rd, she led a sortie out of the gates. It was a skirmish, nothing more. But as she tried to retreat, the drawbridge was raised too early, trapping her outside. She was pulled from her horse by a Burgundian archer. She was a prisoner. The Burgundians held her for months, waiting for Charles VII to pay her ransom. He did not. The king who owed his crown to her did nothing. He did not offer money. He did not threaten retaliation. He simply let her rot. Perhaps he felt she had become a liability, a fanatic who would not let him make peace. Perhaps he was just ungrateful. History has never forgiven him for it. Finally, the Burgundians sold her to the English for 10,000 livres. The English did not want to just kill her. They wanted to destroy her legend. They needed to prove that she was a witch, a heretic, and a fraud. If she was a witch, then Charles VII's coronation was the work of the devil, and he was not the true king. They took her to Rouen, the seat of English power in Normandy. They put her on trial for heresy. It was a show trial, presided over by pro-English clerics. They grilled her for weeks, trying to trap her in theological knots. "Do you know if you are in the grace of God?" they asked. A trap. For to say yes was presumption, and to say no was an admission of guilt. Joan replied with a simplicity that stunned them. "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." But the verdict was predetermined. She was condemned as a relapsed heretic. On May 30th, 1431, she was taken to the old marketplace in Rouen. They tied her to a tall pillar so the flames would reach her slowly. She asked for a cross. An English soldier, moved by pity, made her a small one out of 2 sticks. She held it to her chest as the fire was lit. As the flames rose, she did not scream curses at her enemies. She screamed the name of Jesus over and over again. When the fire finally died down, the executioner was ordered to rake back the ashes, to show the crowd her charred body, to prove she had not escaped. Then they threw her remains into the Seine River, so no relics could be kept. The English thought they had burned a witch. They thought they had ended the threat. They were wrong. They had created a martyr. The flames of Rouen did not destroy Joan of Arc. They purified her. And from the ashes, a new spirit of resistance rose, one that no treaty or army could extinguish. The war was far from over, but the soul of France had been saved. The smoke from the pyre in Rouen drifted away, but the fire Joan of Arc had lit in the hearts of the French people did not go out. In fact, her death in 1431 achieved something that her life could not. It turned the war from a dynastic squabble into a holy cause. The English had hoped that by burning the witch they would break the spell. Instead, they found themselves haunted by her memory. Every defeat they suffered afterward was whispered to be God's vengeance for the maid. However, the war did not end overnight. It dragged on, ugly and grinding, into the 1430s. The English still held Paris, they still held Normandy, and they still had a king, the young Henry VI, whom they were desperate to crown in France to counter the coronation of Charles VII. In December 1431, just months after Joan's execution, the English brought the 10-year-old Henry to Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. It was meant to be a moment of majesty, a rival spectacle to Charles's anointing at Reims, but it was a dismal failure. The ceremony was rushed. The French crowds were small and sullen. The English soldiers guarding the procession looked nervous. Unlike the holy oil of Reims, which was said to have been brought by a dove from heaven, the oil used for Henry was just oil. To the medieval mind, sensitive to symbols, the contrast was glaring. Henry VI was a king of parchment. Charles VII was a king of God. But the real turning point came not on a battlefield, but in a conference room. The English power in France rested entirely on their alliance with Burgundy. Without the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, holding the north and east, the English were just an island nation trying to occupy a continent, and Philip was getting tired. He was tired of the war, disrupting the lucrative wool trade between Flanders and England. He was tired of the English treating him like a junior partner. And perhaps most importantly, he was tired of the guilt. His father, John the Fearless, had been murdered by Charles VII's men. Yes, but how long must a blood feud last when it is destroying the kingdom? In 1435, the great powers of Europe gathered in the city of Arras to try to broker a peace. It was the diplomatic event of the century. Cardinals from Rome arrived in red robes acting as mediators. As the English delegation came with stiff upper lips, demanding that Charles VII renounce the crown. The French delegation came with a new confidence, refusing to budge. For days they argued in Latin, citing treaties and lineage. But the real negotiation was happening in the shadows, between the French and the Burgundians. Charles VII, now growing into the wise king history remembers, made Philip an offer he couldn't refuse. He offered a public apology for the murder of Philip's father. He offered territory, the Somme towns, and he offered to exempt Philip from paying feudal taxes for the rest of his life. In exchange, Philip had to do one thing: abandon the English. Philip accepted. On September 21st, 1435, the Treaty of Arras was signed. It was a diplomatic earthquake. The Anglo-Burgundian alliance, the bedrock of English success for 20 years, shattered. To make matters worse for England, their greatest leader, John, Duke of Bedford, the man who had held the conquest together since Agincourt, died in Rouen just days before the treaty was finalised. It was a double blow. England had lost its only competent regent and its only powerful ally in the same week. The reaction in London was furious. The English populace, who had been fed a steady diet of victory propaganda, could not understand why they were losing. They blamed the traitor Burgundy. Mobs attacked Flemish merchants in London, but anger could not change the math. Without Burgundy, the English occupation of Paris became untenable. In the spring of 1436, the French army approached Paris. They did not need to storm the walls. The citizens of Paris, who had once shouted, "Long live the King of England," were now starving and disillusioned. They opened the gates of Saint-Jacques to the French commander, the Constable de Richemont. The English garrison, commanded by Lord Willoughby, retreated to the Bastille. They were trapped. A few days later, they were allowed to leave the city, marching out amidst the jeers of the crowd. Charles VII did not enter his capital immediately. He waited, cautious as ever, until the city was secure and the plague had subsided. When he finally rode into Paris in November 1437, it was a moment of profound vindication. The king, who had been banished to the provinces, the King of Bourges, was now the master of Paris. The English were pushed back to Normandy and Guyenne. The map of the war was beginning to look very different, but Charles VII knew that reclaiming territory was not enough. He had to keep it. And to do that, he needed to fix the fatal flaw of the French monarchy: the army. For 100 years, France had relied on feudal levies, nobles who fought when they felt like it and went home when the harvest was due, and mercenaries, the free companies, who were often more dangerous to the French peasants than to the English. These mercenaries, or écorcheurs, flayers, were a plague. They stripped the skin off the land, robbing and burning to survive between contracts. Charles decided to do something radical. He would create the first standing army in Western Europe since the Roman Empire. In 1439, he summoned the Estates General and passed a revolutionary tax called the tille. Unlike previous taxes, which were raised for specific campaigns, the tille was permanent. It gave the king a steady income that did not depend on the whims of his nobles. With this money, Charles created the Compagnie d'Ordonnance. These were units of professional cavalry, paid regularly by the state, housed in barracks, and subjected to strict discipline. No more looting, no more going home for the harvest. These men were soldiers, 365 days a year. Each lance consisted of a man-at-arms, a squire, a page, and 2 archers. There were to be 20 companies, totaling about 6,000 men. It doesn't sound like much by modern standards, but in the 15th century, a disciplined, paid force of that size was a sledgehammer. The nobility hated it. They saw it for what it was: a direct threat to their power. If the king had his own army, he didn't need the dukes and counts anymore. In 1440, a group of great nobles, including the Duke of Bourbon and even the king's own son, the Dauphin Louis, the future Louis I, rose up in revolt. They called their rebellion the Praguerie, named after the recent Hussite revolts in Prague. They thought they could bully Charles VII, just as they had bullied his father. But Charles was not his father. He moved his new professional army against the rebels with terrifying speed. He crushed the revolt without a major battle, simply by outmaneuvering and intimidating the nobles. He pardoned his son. Louis was too valuable to kill, but he made his point clear. The days of feudal anarchy were over. The king was the state. While Charles was building his state, England was falling apart. The young Henry VI had grown into a man who was gentle, pious, and utterly unsuited for the ruthless game of kingship. He founded Eton College and King's College, Cambridge, preferring prayer and study to war. He loathed bloodshed. His court was a snake pit of rival factions, with the peace party led by the Earl of Suffolk and the war party led by the Duke of Gloucester tearing each other apart. In 1444, the English government, broke and exhausted, agreed to the Truce of Tours. To seal the peace, Henry VI married a French princess, Margaret of Anjou. Margaret was beautiful, strong-willed, and fierce, everything her husband was not. But the marriage came with a secret price. In a private clause of the treaty, the English agreed to hand over the province of Maine to France. When this news leaked out years later, it would cause a scandal that would shake the English throne to its foundations. For now, though, there was silence. The guns fell silent. The fields were ploughed. The Truce of Tours lasted for 5 years, from 1444 to 1449. To the English, it was a chance to rest. To Charles VII, it was a chance to sharpen the knife. He used the peace to drill his new army, to repair his castles, and to invest in a new technology that was about to change the world. In the workshops of Paris and Tours, 2 brothers, Jean and Gaspard Bureau, were conducting experiments. They were not noblemen, they were bureaucrats, practical men of science. They were obsessed with gunpowder. Until now, cannons had been massive, unwieldy bombards, great iron tubes that could only be moved by teams of oxen and fired once an hour. They were useful for sieges, but useless in battle. The Bureau brothers changed that. They cast lighter cannons out of bronze. They put them on carriages with the wheels so they could be moved quickly. And most importantly, they improved the powder, corning it into small grains that burned more evenly and powerfully. They created the first field artillery. These were guns that could travel with the army, set up in minutes, and fire iron balls that could punch through a formation of knights or shatter a castle gate from a mile away. The English, sitting in their garrisons in Normandy, playing dice, and complaining about their back pay, had no idea what was coming. They were still fighting the War of Agincourt, dreaming of longbows and stakes. They did not realize that the age of chivalry was dead and the age of the gun had begun. The truce broke in 1449. An English mercenary, bored and unpaid, seized a French border town, giving Charles the excuse he needed. The French army rolled into Normandy. But this was not the slow, stumbling army of the past. This was a machine. The towns of Normandy, which had taken Henry V months to starve into submission, fell to Charles VII in days. Why? Because the Bureau brothers would roll their cannons up to the walls, blow a hole in the masonry within hours, and the garrison would surrender before the dust had settled. The English commander in Rouen, the brave old veteran Talbot, found himself helpless. The citizens of Rouen opened the gates to the French. The English were retreating everywhere. In a panic, the English government scraped together a relief army and sent it across the Channel under Sir Thomas Kyriel. They landed in 1450, hoping to repeat the glories of the past. They met the French at a village called Formigny, and there the tragedy of the English longbow finally played out. The English archers took up their positions, planted their stakes, and waited. They invited the French to charge, just as they had at Crécy and Agincourt. But the French did not charge. Instead, they brought up two small culverins, cannons on the flank. The guns boomed. Iron balls ploughed through the lines of archers, smashing bodies and bows alike. The archers, who had decimated the French nobility for a century, were helpless against this fire. They were forced to break their formation and charge the guns. That was when the French heavy cavalry, the Compagnie d'Ordonnance, swept in and cut them down. Formigny was the tomb of the longbow. The English army was annihilated. Normandy was lost. The end was near, and it would be loud. By 1451, the English presence in northern France had evaporated like rain on a hot stone. Normandy, the land of William the Conqueror and the bedrock of English ambition, was gone. The garrisons had surrendered, the soldiers had marched home, and the French king Charles VII was master of the north. In London, the mood was one of shock and recrimination. The loss of Normandy was not just a strategic blow, it was a national humiliation. The Duke of Suffolk, blamed for the disaster, was banished and then beheaded by pirates on his way into exile. The king, Henry VI, drifted further into a holy stupor, leaving the government to be torn apart by wolves. But in the south, in the sun-drenched vineyards of Gascony, the story was different. You see, Gascony was not like Normandy. It had been English territory for 300 years, ever since Eleanor of Aquitaine married Henry II in 1152. The people of Bordeaux did not speak English, but they drank English ale, and more importantly, they sold their wine to London. The economic tie was stronger than any bloodline. When the French army arrived in 1451 to liberate them, the Gascons did not cheer. They grumbled. They looked at the new French tax collectors, the arrogant officials from Paris, and they remembered the days of the good king across the water who bought their claret and left them alone. So they sent a secret message to London. "Come back," they whispered. "If you land an army, we will open the gates." The English government desperate for a victory to prop up the failing regime, scraped together one last expeditionary force. They did not have much money, and they did not have many men, perhaps 3,000. But they had a legend. They gave command to John Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury. Talbot was over 80 years old, an ancient age for the 15th century. He was the English Achilles, a man whose name was used by French mothers to frighten their children into behaving. He was a relic of the old war, a man of the sword and the charge, a contemporary of Henry V, who had refused to retire. When Talbot landed near Bordeaux in October 1452, the years seemed to fall away. The gates of the city were thrown open. The citizens expelled the French garrison and welcomed the old lion with tears and wine. In a matter of weeks, most of western Gascony was back in English hands. It was a stunning reversal. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed that the 100 Years' War was not over, that the English could still turn back the tide. Charles VII, however, did not panic. He spent the winter gathering his forces. He did not rush south to meet Talbot in a glorious open battle. He waited for the spring, and when he moved, he brought with him the new masters of warfare, the Bureau brothers, and their guns. In the summer of 1453, the French army marched into Gascony. They did not attack Bordeaux directly. Instead, they laid siege to the town of Castillon, a strategic point along the Dordogne River. Talbot, hearing of the siege, was urged by the townspeople to save them. "My lord," they pleaded, "will you let our neighbours be eaten by the French?" Talbot, driven by honour and perhaps a touch of the arrogance that comes with being a living legend, agreed. He marched out of Bordeaux on July 17th, 1453. When he arrived at Castillon, his scouts reported something strange. The French were not drawn up in a battle line. They were hiding. Jean Bureau had built a massive fortified camp surrounded by a ditch and a palisade of stakes. Inside, he had placed 300 cannons, pointed outward like the quills of a porcupine. It was not a battlefield, it was a kill box. Talbot, leading the vanguard, cleared a small force of French archers from a priory near the camp. He ordered his men to rest and drink some wine. Then, a messenger ran up. Breathless, he claimed to have seen a cloud of dust rising from the French camp and wagons moving away. "They are retreating," the messenger cried. "The French are fleeing. My lord, if we strike now, we can catch them from behind." It was a mistake. The dust was not from a retreat. It was from the camp followers, moving the baggage to safety. The army and the guns were still there. But Talbot, the old warrior who had spent his life chasing French armies that refused to fight, could not resist the bait. He did not wait for his own artillery to catch up. He did not wait for his full infantry force. He ordered an immediate assault. Talbot mounted his horse. He was not wearing armour. He had been captured previously and released on parole, swearing not to wear armour against the King of France. Being a man of his word, he rode into battle in a crimson velvet doublet and a soft cap, the only unarmoured man in a sea of steel. He rode a small white cob, an easy target, visible to everyone. "Forward!" he shouted. "For St. George and the King!" The English charged. They surged toward the French camp, shouting their war cries, expecting to hack down fleeing cowards. Instead, they ran straight into the face of the future. Jean Bureau waited. He watched the English rush over the open ground. He waited until they were packed together, until he could see the whites of their eyes. And then he dropped his hand. 300 guns fired at once. The sound was unlike anything heard on a battlefield before. It was not the crack of thunder, it was the roar of the apocalypse. The ground shook. A storm of iron balls, chain shot and lead canister ripped through the English ranks. It didn't just kill men, it erased them. Entire files of soldiers were blown apart. The smoke was instantaneous and blinding, a thick, sulphurous fog that choked the lungs and stung the eyes. But the English were stubborn. They were the sons of the men who had stood at Agincourt. They did not break. They rallied and charged again, scrambling through the ditch, trying to hack at the wooden palisades with their axes. Talbot rode back and forth on his white cob, urging them on, ignoring the carnage. But every time the smoke cleared, the French guns fired again. The cannonballs punched through breastplates as if they were paper. The English archers, trying to return fire, found their arrows bouncing harmlessly off the wooden walls of the camp. For an hour, the slaughter continued. It was the death of chivalry, played out in real time. The bravery of the knight, the skill of the swordsman, the strength of the longbowman, none of it mattered. The machine was winning. Then, the final blow fell. A shot from a culverin, a small cannon, struck Talbot's horse. The white cob collapsed, its legs shattered. Talbot fell heavily to the ground, pinned beneath the animal. He lay there, an 80-year-old man in a velvet coat, trapped in the mud of a foreign field. A French archer named Michel Pérunin saw him. He did not see a legendary hero. He saw an enemy commander. He walked over, raised his battle axe and brought it down. With Talbot dead, the English spirit broke. They turned and fled toward the river, pursued by the French cavalry, who swept out from behind the guns. The river Dordogne ran red with blood for miles. Thousands of English soldiers were cut down in the water. It was a total annihilation. The news of Castillon reached Bordeaux like a funeral bell. The hope that had flared so brightly with Talbot's arrival was extinguished. There was no other army coming. There was no money in London to raise one. The city held out for a few more months, out of loyalty and fear, but in October 1453, Bordeaux surrendered. The English commanders walked out of the city gates. The French fleur-de-lis was raised over the ramparts, and this time it would stay there. After 300 years, the English presence in Aquitaine was over. The ships sailed back to England, carrying the survivors, the refugees, and the body of John Talbot. There was no formal treaty signed to end the war. There was no great conference like Bretigny or Troyes. The war simply stopped. The English were gone. They retained only the port of Calais in the far north, a solitary toehold that they would keep for another century, but the dream of a continental empire was dead. The year 1453 is often cited as the end of the Middle Ages. In the east, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks, ending the Roman Empire. In the west, the Battle of Castillon ended the 100 Years' War. It was a year where the old world, the world of knights and walls and feudal oaths, was violently dismantled by gunpowder and professional armies. As the sun set on the field of Castillon, the scavengers moved among the dead, stripping the armour from the broken bodies. The age of the mounted knight was over, though it would take them a few more decades to realise it. The age of the nation-state had begun. France, forged in the fires of a century of war, was no longer a loose collection of duchies. It was a kingdom. And England, stripped of its foreign distractions, was forced to look inward, to an island destiny that would eventually lead it to a different kind of empire across a different ocean. But that is a story for the future. For now, we stand on the cliffs of Dover, looking back across the grey channel one last time. The fires are out. The armies are gone. The long, bloody century is over. The ships that carried the survivors of Castillon back to England in 1453 did not bring peace, they brought a contagion. They carried thousands of archers, men-at-arms and knights who had spent their entire lives in a trade that no longer existed. These men returned to an island that felt small, grey and claustrophobic after the wide, sunlit plains of Aquitaine. They found a king, Henry VI, who had lapsed into a catatonic stupor upon hearing the news of the loss of Bordeaux. For 18 months the King of England sat like a stone statue, unable to speak, move, or recognise his own newborn son. The government collapsed. The rival factions of nobles, the House of York and the House of Lancaster, who had sharpened their teeth on French battlefields, now turned their hunger upon each other. It is one of history's dark ironies that the end of the 100 Years' War was the direct spark for the Wars of the Roses. The captains who had commanded garrisons in Normandy, men like the Duke of York and the Duke of Somerset, brought their private armies home and simply continued the war on English soil. The archers who had stood at Agincourt now loosed their shafts at their own countrymen on the snowy fields of Towton. England would spend the next 30 years tearing itself apart, purging the violence that had been frustrated in France. The dream of a continental empire was washed away in a flood of domestic blood. Meanwhile, across the Channel, France was healing. But it was a different kind of France. The war had burned away the loose feudal tapestry of the Middle Ages, leaving behind a hard, centralised state. Charles VII, the victorious, spent his final years solidifying the power he had won. When he died in 1461, he was succeeded by his son Louis I, a man so cunning and ruthless that his enemies called him the Universal Spider. Louis I did not care for the pomp of chivalry. He wore old, threadbare clothes and travelled with a small retinue of hangmen and barbers rather than dukes. He understood what the war had taught, that power was not about charging on a horse. It was about money, intelligence, and patience. He used the standing army his father had built, not to conquer foreign lands, but to crush the last rebellious French nobles. He wove a web of treaties and bribes that strangled the Duke of Burgundy, finally uniting the hexagon of France under a single absolute monarch. The nation of France, a concept that would have been alien to a peasant in 1337, was now a reality forged in the fire of English aggression. There was, however, one final strange echo of the war to play out. In 1475, 22 years after the guns fell silent at Castillon, an English army landed in France one last time. King Edward IV, a giant of a man and a warrior of the Roses, crossed the Channel with the largest English force ever assembled. He came to reclaim the French crown, dusting off the old claim of Edward III. It seemed the nightmare was about to begin all over again. But this was a new age. Louis I, the Spider King, did not call out his knights. He did not summon the ban. Instead, he invited Edward to a bridge at Picquigny, near Amiens. He ordered a large wooden grate to be built across the middle of the bridge, like a lion's cage, so that the two kings could talk but could not kill each other, a testament to a century of broken trust. On a sunny day in August, the two monarchs met. Edward, tall and magnificent in gold cloth, stood on one side. Louis, stooped and wearing a simple traveller's cloak, stood on the other. They did not fight, they haggled. Louis offered Edward a massive lump sum of 75,000 crowns and a yearly pension of 50,000 crowns to simply go home. He essentially bought off the invasion. Edward, pragmatic and preferring cash to dysentery, agreed. He took the money, signed the Treaty of Picquigny, and sailed back to England to enjoy his retirement. It was an anticlimactic, almost comical end to a conflict that had defined the Middle Ages. There was no final heroic charge, only a transaction on a bridge, but it marked the true end of the hostilities. The English kings would continue to style themselves King of France on their coins and official documents until the year 1801, a harmless bit of royal vanity. But the reality was settled. England was an island, France was a continent. Their paths had diverged forever. The legacy of the 100 Years' War is written in the very language we speak and the maps we draw. Before the war, the English nobility spoke French. By the end, they spoke English, a language of the people that had become the language of the nation. The war killed the dream of a cross-channel empire, but it gave birth to two distinct national identities. It taught kings that their power relied on the consent and the taxes of their subjects. It replaced the erratic service of the feudal knight with the professional discipline of the soldier. It introduced the gun, the tax collector, and the national border. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is the story itself. It is a story that moves from the bright primary colours of heraldry to the grey smoke of gunpowder. It is the story of how a dynastic lawsuit became a struggle for survival. It is the story of the Black Prince and the Maid of Orleans, of the longbow and the cannon, of the famine and the feast. It is a reminder that history is not a straight line of progress, but a jagged scar, healed over by time, but never truly gone. End of script, sweet dreams. Now let the centuries fade. The noise of the cannons at Castillon drifts away, replaced by the gentle rhythmic sound of the sea washing against the white cliffs of Dover. The kings and captains, the archers and the saints have all laid down their burdens. They are sleeping now, resting in the quiet earth of two kingdoms that have long since found peace. The maps are rolled up. The ink is dry. The fires in the hearths of the great castles have burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft, warm light on the stone floors. The wind that once carried arrows now carries only the scent of rain and sleeping fields. You have walked a long road tonight, through 116 years of struggle and endurance. You have seen the resilience of the human spirit, the way hope can bloom even in the mud of a battlefield. But that is all in the past. It is a story in a book, and the book is closing. Let your breathing slow, matching the quiet tide of history. The night is deep and still. The stars that looked down on Agincourt and Orleans are the same stars watching over you now, steady and serene. There are no more battles to be fought tonight, no more marches to make. There is only the safety of your own bed, the warmth of your covers, and the heavy, comforting blanket of sleep. Drift away from the history, away from the dates and the names. Let them dissolve into the darkness. You are safe. You are at rest. The world will turn without you for a while. Close your eyes. Let go. Good night.